Hello and welcome to this delightful, clean, historical Western romance by Shelfie audiobook. We're thrilled to have you join us. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Your support in these small ways helps us bring you more heartwarming romance stories at no cost. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away into a world of adventure, love, and unforgettable characters. Enjoy! This audiobook is copyrighted by Shelfie Bennett, Part 1. The sun dipped low over Silver Creek, casting a burnt orange glow across the town's dusty streets. The evening air carried the hum of a town coming alive, the soft clop of horse-drawn carts on the gravel roads mixing with the jingle of spurs and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It was a sound as familiar to the town as the ever-present dust that clung to every surface, a constant reminder of life in the West. The Painted Rose Saloon stood at the heart of it all, its wooden sign creaking in the wind, the faint glow of gas lamps spilling out onto the street. The warm light flickered against the darkening sky, painting the worn boards with gold, like an old portrait left out in the rain. A breeze stirred, carrying the smell of sweat, horses, and the sharp tang of whiskey through the open windows, where a few early patrons lingered, their laughter and voices muffled by the heavy wooden walls. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, hanging low and heavy in the dimly lit room. The scent of aged wood, whiskey, and leather seeped into every corner. Kate Mercer moved behind the bar, the steady rhythm of her boots a quiet counterpoint to the chaotic din of the place. She adjusted the collar of her faded yet serviceable dress, her fingers brushing the soft fabric as she scanned the room, noting the handful of rowdy cowboys leaning against the bar and the poker game in the corner, chips clinking as the men cursed under their breath. She was a sharp one, Kate Mercer, a woman used to the rough edges of this life, honed by years of running the Painted Rose. Her face, framed by auburn curls that had long since fallen loose from their braid, was set in a permanent expression of quiet authority. Her green eyes never stopped moving, watching, calculating, keeping tabs on every patron that walked through the door. She'd learned early on that a quiet word or a well-timed glare could settle an argument before it turned into a brawl. And in a saloon like this, that was a skill worth its weight in gold. Her tired yet firm smile greeted the regulars as they made their way to the bar, tipping their hats or grinning sheepishly as they slid a coin her way. There was a comfort in this routine, the familiar faces, the same dusty floorboards, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional laughter of someone finding solace in a drink. But it was also a battle, one she fought every day just to keep the doors open. Horace Wheeler's saloon across the street was a constant thorn in her side, drawing away business with its flashy signs and louder, more ostentatious displays of wealth. Kate fought for every patron that walked through her door, every drink served and every game won at the poker table. Her uncle had run the Painted Rose before her, and the saloon was the only thing left to her after he passed 2 years ago. He'd been a good man, a hard one, but good. He taught her how to run the place, how to keep the riffraff in line, how to make the best whiskey in Silver Creek, how to maintain a place where men could forget the world outside for a while. It had been his pride, his legacy. Now it was hers, and she'd be damned if she let it slip through her fingers. The saloon was her life, her anchor, and every decision she made revolved around it. Kate wiped a glass with a rag, her eyes drifting over to the doorway where a few newcomers had just entered. She'd learned the hard way not to judge a man by his appearance, but when they looked like trouble, they usually were. She kept her face neutral, one hand still on the glass, the other poised for any sudden movements, ready to step in if things started to get out of hand. Silver Creek was a town built on the roughest of people, and Kate had become as tough as any of them. If you were going to survive in a place like this, you had to be quick on your feet, sharp with your words, and, when necessary, prepared to stand your ground, and Kate Mercer had learned all those lessons well. Her fingers brushed the silver locket hanging around her neck, an old relic of her family, one she didn't often think about. The weight of it was a reminder of the past, a past she couldn't escape. It was the one thing she had left of her uncle, of the family that had built the Painted Rose from the ground up. It was all she had now. She shook off the thoughts. There was work to be done, always work. And if there was one thing Kate Mercer was good at, it was making sure that the Painted Rose Saloon, for all its grit and grime, stayed standing. The saloon door swung open with a jingle of bells that rang through the heavy air like a gunshot. The chatter in the room stilled for just a moment before it picked up again. Quieter now, as if everyone had drawn in a single, collective breath. Jesse Calloway stood in the doorway, a tall, rugged silhouette framed by the last slivers of daylight. His black duster coat swirled around his legs as he stepped inside, boots heavy on the creaky floorboards. His dark eyes swept the room with a sharp, calculating gaze, as though he was measuring every inch of it. The tables, the faces, the exits. A man who saw 100 angles in a single glance. He was a stranger, yet somehow everyone knew him. The whispers started almost immediately, low and quick, like wind through dry grass. Eyes shifted, men leaned in close, their voices turning hushed but eager. Colored out. "That's the one," someone muttered under his breath, his voice full of a mix of fear and curiosity. "The outlaw?" another man asked, clearly surprised. "I heard he killed a dozen men, robbing trains and banking on a death sentence." "Well, he's got a price on his head. Alive or dead, they'll pay for him," came the reply, voice dropping even lower. "No one's ever got close enough to take him in. Not yet." Jesse moved like he owned the place, though he hadn't touched a thing. His boots left prints in the dust, and his presence sent a ripple through the air, shifting the mood like the crack of a whip. His unshaven jaw was set hard, like he hadn't known comfort in years. His face, weathered from the sun, looked like it had seen its share of trouble and caused just as much. But it wasn't his face that made men uneasy. It was the way he carried himself. No fear, no hesitation, just a kind of silent knowing that made the room feel smaller. Kate noticed him the moment he walked in. She'd seen plenty of rough types in her time, but there was something different about him. Dangerous, sure, but in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle with more than just caution. It was a presence, raw and unrelenting, like the edge of a knife, and it cut through the usual noise of the Painted Rose like a hot wind through a dry prairie. He made his way to the bar, every step deliberate, his eyes scanning the room one last time before he settled at the counter. He leaned a shoulder against it with the ease of a man used to rough roads and harder men. Without looking up, he slapped a few coins on the bar and said, "Whiskey." "Neat." His voice was low and gravelly, rough, as if it had been scraped across miles of desert. The sound of it dropped into the air like a stone sinking into water, and the saloon fell just a little quieter, the tension thickening. Kate stepped forward, her heels clicking on the floor as she moved toward him. She'd heard the stories, of course, everybody had, but she wasn't the kind to let a man's reputation steer her actions. She had enough trouble on her hands without adding unknowns to the mix. "Whiskey's $1, she said, keeping her voice steady as she reached for the bottle. Jesse's eyes locked onto hers then. Dark, unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in them. A challenge, maybe, or a question, or both. "I know what it costs," he said, his lips twitching into something almost like a smirk. "I'll pay." Kate set the bottle down and slid the glass over to him. She didn't take her eyes off his, waiting. Something about the way he stood there, half turning towards the door like he might leave as easily as he'd entered, made her uneasy. Or maybe it was the way his hand rested casually near the holster at his waist, fingers just close enough to the gun to remind everyone in the room who had the real power. "You're a long way from wherever you came from," she said, her voice carrying the right mix of curiosity and caution, her fingers brushing the edge of the bar as she leaned in slightly, just enough to close the distance between them. Jessie's gaze drifted slowly down to her hand, then back up to her face, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. He straightened, taking the glass without a word, his fingers brushing hers as he did. The slight touch felt like more than just a hand-to-glass transfer. His presence seemed to fill the space between them, and for a moment, Kate wondered if he was playing a game she didn't fully understand. "You know," Jessie drawled, swirling the whiskey in the glass with slow, deliberate movements. "I've heard of this place. Figured I'd see for myself what all the fuss was about." "And what do you think?" Kate asked, leaning against the bar, her posture casual, but with the weight of 1,000 unspoken challenges between them. He took a long drink, eyes never leaving hers. When he set the glass down, there was a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. "I think it's got character," he said, the words just a touch too smooth, like he was testing them. "But I reckon it's got a few problems, too." Kate raised an eyebrow, a challenge simmering just under her words. "Ain't that the truth? But trouble tends to find folks around here." A smile tugged at the corner of Jesse's mouth, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Trouble?" he said, his voice almost teasing, like he was enjoying the way this was playing out. "I don't suppose you mean me." "Maybe," she replied coolly, straightening up. "Or maybe I mean the folks who've been causing problems for months. You ain't the first one to walk in here thinking they could take this place for their own. But you won't be the last, either." He chuckled low in his chest, a sound as rich and dangerous as the whiskey he drank. "We'll see about that." Kate held his gaze, feeling the tension in the room tighten. There was more to this man than just his reputation, and something in the way he carried himself told her he wasn't here by accident. But whether that was good or bad, she couldn't decide yet. For now, she just watched him, watched how he sat at her bar like he belonged, watched how the saloon seemed to hold its breath when he did. He wasn't just another outlaw or drifter, there was something else in him, something dangerous, and Kate, no stranger to danger herself, felt the tug of it. She broke the silence, her voice as sharp as ever. "You planning on staying long?" Jesse's eyes twinkled and he leaned back just a little, as though he had all the time in the world. "That depends on how well this place treats me." Kate's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. "I'm sure we'll find out soon enough." And with that, the game began. Kate barely had a chance to take another breath before the door swung open with a violent crash. The bell above the frame jingled once, loud, obnoxious, and then a shadow filled the doorway. Horace Wheeler's broad shoulders blocked the light from outside, his smug smile hanging like a noose around his neck. He was flanked by two of his men, burly as oxen, with hard eyes and fists the size of hams. The moment they stepped in, the atmosphere in the painted rows shifted, like a storm rolling in on the horizon. Wheeler took in the room with a glance, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Kate behind the bar. His boots thudded heavily against the wood as he strode forward, the creak of the floorboards beneath him marking his every step. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice grating like sandpaper, "if it ain't the little lady herself. Still trying to make a name for yourself in this town, eh?" Kate stayed still, though her grip on the glass she'd been polishing tightened. She'd been expecting this, knew it was just a matter of time before Wheeler tried to press her again. Her saloon had been his target for months, ever since his flashy new joint across the street started pulling in more and more of the regulars. His usual tactic was to try and intimidate her into selling. He thought it was just business. To Kate, it was personal. "You know damn well what I mean," Wheeler continued, his voice dripping with thinly veiled menace. "Your saloon's been cutting into my profits, Mercer. This town ain't big enough for both of us, and I'm tired of playing nice. It's time you sold out, and I don't much care what price you put on it." Kate's smile was sharp as a razor, but her eyes were colder. "You've been trying that same old song and dance for months, Wheeler," she said, her voice steady but carrying a bite of warning. "I ain't interested. You'd be better off trying to sell your own saloon. You're just too damn proud to admit you've been peddling watered-down whiskey and bad air." Wheeler's smile faltered, but he didn't back down. Instead, he leaned in, his face close enough now that she could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "I don't think you understand, sweetheart," he muttered, sneering. "You've got a choice to make. Either you sell, or I make you sell." Before Kate could respond, one of Wheeler's goons, a thick-necked brute with a face full of scars, shoved a local patron out of the way. The man staggered back, nearly crashing into the table behind him. The air in the saloon went from tense to thick, like the quiet before a storm. A few of the other customers looked up, uneasy murmurs spreading through the room. "Now hold on there, fellas," Kate said, raising a hand, trying to maintain some control over the situation. "This ain't the way you want to handle it," but Wheeler's goons were already causing trouble, shoving people around, spilling drinks. Kate felt the heat in her chest rise, her hand tightening around the bar. The last thing she needed was another full-blown fight. Things were already close to boiling over when her eyes landed on Jesse, still sitting at the bar, his whiskey untouched. His posture hadn't changed, leaning back in his chair, a faint smirk playing at the edge of his lip. He didn't look like a man who was about to get involved. But as the situation escalated, something shifted in the way he watched Wheeler's men. The thug closest to the bar grabbed a woman by the arm, yanking her roughly away from the table. That's when Jesse's expression changed, his dark eyes narrowing with a cold intent. He stood slowly, his movements smooth and calculated, and set his glass down on the counter with a soft clink that was somehow louder than the chaos building around him. In one fluid motion, Jesse moved toward the man, his hand darting to his holster. The thug never saw it coming. Jesse's grip was quick and firm, spinning the man around and yanking his gun from its holster in a single movement. Before anyone had time to blink, Jesse hurled the thug toward the far wall, the man's body slamming into it with a crash that sent chairs skidding across the floor. The room fell silent for a split second, every eye trained on the stranger. Then, like a switch was flipped, the chaos erupted again. But this time, it was different. Jesse's actions had cleared the air of doubt. His calm presence shattered the tension, and the rest of the room seemed to recognize it. The thug who had been knocked to the floor groaned and staggered to his feet, but Jesse was already on him, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening thud. The second thug lunged at Jesse, but he was no match for the stranger's quick reflexes. A swift kick sent the man crashing into the back table, flipping it over with a sound like thunder. Wheeler's face went pale, his sneer replaced by a scowl as he backed away, realizing he'd miscalculated. His men were down, out cold on the floor, their grunts and groans filling the now silent room. Kate stood frozen, watching Jesse take control of the room like it was nothing more than a Tuesday for him. Her heart pounded, a mix of disbelief and gratitude surging through her. She'd seen plenty of scuffles in this place, but this was something else. The fight ended as quickly as it started, and just like that, Jesse was back at the bar, leaning casually against it as if he hadn't just single-handedly cleared a path for peace. The patrons were still, unsure whether they should be thankful or terrified. Kate met Jesse's gaze across the bar, and for the first time she let the smile that had been teasing the corner of her lips break through. It wasn't a smile of victory, it was a silent thank you, one that said more than words ever could. "Guess you've got a way with problems," Kate said, her voice smooth but edged with something unspoken. She wiped her hands on a rag, the tension beginning to lift from her shoulders. Jesse tipped his hat, his lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just knowing when to stand, when to sit," he said, his voice low and steady, "and when to knock a man down." Kate watched him for a beat, her heart still racing, before she turned her attention to the back of the room, where Wheeler and his men were licking their wounds. "Guess that's one way to settle it," she said under her breath. "You're welcome," Jesse replied, his voice never more than a casual drawl. Kate didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward the door, her gaze scanning the room once more. When she met Jesse's eyes again, she held them for just a moment longer, an understanding passing between them. The Painted Rose was her turf, and Jesse Calloway had just proven he was a man who could keep it that way. The saloon had fallen back into its usual rhythm. Low murmurs, the clink of glass, the shuffle of boots on old floorboards. But the air was different now, charged with the lingering tension from the fight. A few of the patrons cast nervous glances toward the door, waiting for the storm to pass. Wheeler's thugs were gone, nursing bruises and pride alike, but they would be back. Kate, however, couldn't focus on them. Her thoughts were still on the man at the bar, the one who'd come out of nowhere and taken control like he owned the place. Jesse Calloway. Outlaw? Trouble? Or something else entirely? She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She owed him. Her boots clicked softly against the wooden floor as she approached him, her gaze wary but not hostile. Her mind was a tangle of conflicting thoughts. He'd stepped in when she needed him, but his reputation hung over him like a storm cloud. The stories were enough to make anyone shudder. Robberies, shootouts, killings. But he'd walked into her saloon, calm as you please, and made it all disappear in a matter of seconds. That wasn't the behavior of some reckless outlaw. Jesse didn't look up when she stopped in front of him. He kept his attention on the glass in front of him, the amber liquid swirling lazily inside. There was a calmness in him, a stillness that made it hard to believe the rumors about him. He seemed like a man who'd seen too much to be fazed by anything. Kate folded her arms across her chest, not sure how to begin. The gratefulness was there, a warm undercurrent, but so was the suspicion. She needed answers, but it wasn't just her curiosity that had her uneasy. It was the undeniable pull he had over her. He was too smooth, too composed. "Well, I guess I owe you a thanks," she said, her voice cool but edged with something softer. "That was some fancy work back there." Jesse lifted his glass slowly, tipping it back with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He set it down again, his eyes finally meeting hers, but there was no arrogance in them, just a quiet, almost detached confidence. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, the kind that left more questions than answers. "Don't mention it, just trying to enjoy a drink," he said, his tone casual, too casual. Kate frowned, watching him as he seemed to drift further into his own world like nothing had changed. "Just trying to enjoy a drink," she repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. She took a step closer, narrowing her eyes. "You've got a funny way of going about it. Saving my saloon 1 minute, throwing men around like sacks of flour the next. That doesn't seem like a man just here for whiskey." Jesse's lips quirked into that same disinterested smile. He didn't respond right away, only leaned back a little in his chair, letting his hand rest casually near his gun belt. The sound of spurs jingling was the only thing that filled the space between them, the low hum of the saloon suddenly distant. "I've got no interest in this town's troubles," he said finally, voice steady. "I'm just here for a bit of quiet. It's been a long ride." Kate's brow furrowed. His words felt practiced, too clean, like he was hiding something under that calm exterior. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" He met her eyes again, the silent exchange between them heavy with meaning. There was something in his gaze, something raw and unspoken. "Believe what you like," he replied, "but facts don't change just 'cause you doubt 'em." Kate wasn't used to men like him. Most men either backed down when they saw she meant business or tried to throw their weight around. But Jesse? He seemed unaffected by her presence, like she didn't rattle him in the least. It wasn't an arrogance she could easily dismiss, but a calmness that unnerved her. There was no doubt in her mind now that he wasn't just some wild outlaw. There was discipline there, a skill that didn't come from running from trouble, but from knowing how to handle it. "I don't trust you," Kate said, her voice soft but firm, like she was stating an undeniable fact. "But I'm not about to turn away the help." Jesse's grin was slight, but it carried that same cool detachment. "Trust's earned, Miss Mercer. Can't rush it. Just asking for a bed for the night. Won't be no trouble." Her eyes flickered to the door, then back to him. The last thing she needed was another confrontation, another round of trouble following him through her door. Yet something in her couldn't ignore the way he handled himself, the way the room settled under his gaze, the way people stayed in their seats instead of rushing to cause another ruckus. She wasn't sure if it was fear or respect, but it was something powerful, and she could feel it shifting in the air around them. Kate hesitated, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the bar as she thought about his request. "You stay, trouble stays," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, almost a warning. "I'm not in the business of babysitting men who bring chaos." Jesse raised an eyebrow, his expression still unreadable, but there was something there, something acknowledging her point. "I reckon I can handle my own chaos. Can you?" Kate asked, leaning a little closer. The tension between them was thick, something unsaid hanging just out of reach. She studied him for a moment longer, then sighed, the weight of the decision pulling at her. "Fine," she said, the word a reluctant concession. "You can have the room above the saloon, just don't make it more trouble than it's worth." Jesse tipped his hat in a silent thanks, a small but genuine nod of respect. "Appreciate it." "I'll be no trouble." Kate turned to walk away, but something made her pause. She didn't turn back, but the words left her mouth before she could stop them. "Just don't forget that people like you don't stay around places like this for long." Jesse's voice followed her, low and steady. "Maybe I'm not here for long, Miss Mercer, but I'm here long enough to see how this ends." Kate didn't know whether to be more unsettled by his words or by the way her heart skipped a beat at them. All she knew was that the air between them had thickened, and she couldn't tell if the storm was still far off or if it had already begun. The evening bled into the night, and the saloon, once filled with raucous laughter and clinking glasses, now stood empty. The patrons had trickled out, leaving only the quiet hum of the evening behind. The warm glow of the lanterns cast long shadows across the room, and the soft scrape of wood against wood echoed as Kate walked slowly across the floor, her boots kicking up the smallest hint of dust that had settled from the day's chaos. She moved with purpose, but each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the night had settled into her bones. Her thoughts, however, were elsewhere, lingering on the man who had walked into her life so suddenly and uninvited, Jesse Calloway. His dark eyes, his calm confidence, the way he'd handled the trouble at the bar with such practiced ease, it all gnawed at her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, hard, unreadable, and yet with something behind it that didn't quite fit the image of the outlaw he was rumored to be. Kate paused by the door, the sound of the lock clicking into place as she secured it. A glance through the small window revealed nothing but the cold night air beyond. The saloon felt different now, more claustrophobic somehow, as if it were holding its breath. She let out a sigh, wiping her hands on the edge of her apron before retreating to her office at the back of the saloon. She sat down at her desk, but the papers in front of her didn't hold her attention. Her fingers drummed on the worn wood as her thoughts wandered back to Jesse. The man was too composed, too steady for someone who'd spent his life on the run. There was a darkness in him. She could feel it in the way he moved, in the quiet way he watched people, always calculating. But he wasn't like the others. No, he didn't fit the mold of the typical outlaw. Her eyes lifted from the desk, half expecting to see him standing in the doorway. He hadn't said much, but every word he spoke lingered like he was testing her, waiting to see how she'd react. Kate pushed the thought aside. She didn't have time for idle curiosity, but it was there, gnawing at her like the sound of hooves in the distance. The faint sound of a creaking floorboard interrupted her thoughts, and she turned sharply. Her eyes scanned the dim light of the hallway outside her office. But there was nothing. The silence pressed in on her again, heavy and suffocating. Then she caught it. A shadow. Jesse leaned against the doorway, his figure barely visible in the half-light. His hat was tilted down just enough to obscure his face, but she could still make out the sharp outline of his jaw, the way his shoulders filled the doorway like he owned it. He hadn't made a sound, but she knew he'd been there for a while, watching her. Kate swallowed, her heart picking up pace for a reason she didn't want to name. She'd been expecting him, hoping he wasn't going to make things more difficult than they already were, but now, with him standing there, quiet and still, she wasn't sure what she felt. Confusion, tension, curiosity, and maybe something more. She couldn't pinpoint it, but it was there, pressing on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. "You're still here," she said, the words escaping her before she could stop them. She couldn't keep the edge out of her voice, but there was something else there, something softer, a flicker of curiosity she couldn't hide. Jesse straightened, the shadows pulling away from his face just enough for her to catch a glimpse of his expression. His eyes softened just a fraction, and there was something almost sympathetic in them, though it didn't reach his mouth. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and even. "Didn't figure you'd be asleep by now," he said, his tone not quite teasing but close. "I reckon you've got a lot on your mind." Kate pressed her lips together, trying to ignore the tension in the room. She could feel it between them, thick and unspoken. She didn't want to show weakness, not to him, not to anyone, but her mind wouldn't let go of the questions, the doubts that had been swirling in her head since he walked through that door. "Well, you've certainly given me enough to think about," she said, her voice sharp, though it lacked the bite it usually carried. "You saved my saloon today, but you're not exactly the type of man I'd welcome under my roof." Jesse pushed off the doorframe, his boots creaking as he moved closer. He didn't cross the room, but he closed the space between them enough that Kate could feel the change in the air. "And what type would that be?" he asked, his tone soft but with a thread of something darker running through it. The kind who doesn't ask questions, maybe? Kate glanced up at him, locking eyes with him for a moment. The silence stretched between them, charged and heavy. She knew there were more layers to him than he let on, but she also knew that this was dangerous ground. "You're not like the rest of them," she muttered, almost to herself. "You've got a different way about you, and I can't figure it out." Jesse's lips quirked into a smile, one that was half amused, half mysterious. "Maybe that's because you're looking too hard, Miss Mercer." He paused, letting the words settle between them. "People like me don't leave easy answers behind." Kate looked away, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She didn't want to admit that she was drawn to the mystery of him, to the way he moved and spoke. But she couldn't help herself. She was starting to wonder how much of the outlaw persona was real and how much of it was just a mask that she wasn't sure she wanted to peel away. Or maybe she was just afraid of what she might find underneath. A long silence passed, and she finally stood, walking toward the window to push aside the curtain and look out into the night. She needed some space, some time to think. "I don't know what you want from me, Jesse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know I've got my own battles to fight, and I can't afford to have someone like you complicating things." Jesse didn't move, but his voice was quieter this time, tinged with something softer, something she didn't know how to read. "No trouble, not unless you make it." Kate didn't respond right away. Her gaze was fixed on the empty street outside, the dim light from the lanterns casting long shadows on the boardwalk. She could feel him there, watching her, the silence wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Finally, she turned back to face him, meeting his eyes once more. "Maybe I'm already in trouble, Jesse, and I don't know if you're going to help me get out of it or drag me deeper." Jesse didn't smile this time. He just looked at her, and for a moment, she could have sworn there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that felt almost like understanding. "Maybe you don't need saving," he said quietly, his voice low. "Maybe you're just looking for a reason to keep going." Kate's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words sinking deep. She didn't have an answer for him, didn't even know how to respond. But as she watched him stand there, silent and still, she realized that the questions she had for him were the same questions she had for herself, and they weren't going away anytime soon. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice a little softer than she meant it to be, "maybe you're right." And with that, the room fell back into silence, the weight of their shared thoughts hanging in the air between them like an unspoken promise. One neither of them was ready to make just yet. The morning sun spilled through the saloon's dusty windows, painting the room with a soft golden hue. The bar, though still slightly wrecked from the night before, was the same weathered wood that had seen countless arguments and celebrations, but today it looked like something Kate needed to tame. The fight had left its marks, scuffed floors and broken chairs, but nothing Kate couldn't handle. Jesse stood beside her, his large hands working with the same easy efficiency he'd shown the night before. He was quieter today, just as he had been last night, his movements measured, like a man used to getting things done without fanfare. His eyes followed her as she worked, but his silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost reassuring, like he wasn't in a rush to fill the air with words. Kate kept busy, carefully setting things right, shifting the chairs, polishing the glassware, sorting the bottles. Her mind kept drifting to him, though, to Jesse. He wasn't like any man she'd known. His presence was steady, like a mountain. Imposing but not overbearing, as though he'd seen it all and didn't need to prove anything. And yet there was something about him, something that pulled at her attention whenever he was near. She wiped her hands on the rag, glancing at him for a moment. "You sure know how to handle yourself," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice held more curiosity than anything else. "Didn't expect you to be handy with tools." Jesse shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Can't always rely on a gun when things get broken." Kate tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was more to that answer than he was letting on, but she didn't press it. Not yet. The saloon needed fixing first. The quiet stretched between them as they worked in tandem, the soft scrape of wood on wood the only sound. She could feel his gaze every now and then, but it wasn't the kind of gaze that made her uneasy. It was just observant, watching, waiting. Kate hesitated for a moment, then finally asked, "So why are you really here, Jesse?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke, curling around her words and daring him to answer. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, Kate thought she saw something shift in them. Something more calculating, something deeper than the quiet outlaw he presented. He let out a slow breath and picked up the hammer again, his hand steady as he nailed the plank back into place. "Got business in Silver Creek?" he said, his voice calm but guarded. "Business that'll need more than a few whiskey shots to settle." Kate raised an eyebrow, her mind immediately going to the idea of him looking for trouble. "Business, huh?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "You sure it's not just another side hustle?" Jesse didn't smile, but something in his eyes darkened, just a shade. "I'm not here to rob anyone, if that's what you mean, not my style," he paused, a brief silence hanging between them before he added, "I'm here to investigate something big, involving the lawman of this town." Kate stopped mid-motion, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of his words. "The sheriff?" Jesse didn't look up as he tightened the last nail into place, but his tone was grave. "The sheriff?" His voice held a weight in it that didn't belong in casual conversation. "There's more going on in this town than anyone realizes." Kate frowned. The sheriff, Coldwell, was a man who had been in charge of Silver Creek for years, always walking that fine line between authority and intimidation. If there was anything shady going on, she wouldn't put it past him. Still, something in her gut told her Jesse was holding back. As always. "And you think you can just come in here and fix it?" she asked, crossing her arms. "A man like you, with a history like yours," Jesse met her gaze then, his expression unreadable. "I reckon I can handle it. But I'm not doing it for you, Ms. Mercer." His words were blunt, and yet there was a flicker of something just out of reach in his voice. "I've got my reasons." Kate let out a slow breath, studying him as if trying to gauge whether he was worth the risk. Her instincts were a tangle of suspicion and curiosity, each one pulling her in different directions. He had saved her saloon, yes, but he had also stepped into a world of trouble she didn't want to involve herself in. And yet, as she watched him, a strange pull tugged at her. An undeniable attraction wrapped in uncertainty. "People like you don't just waltz into town and start fixing problems without a reason," she said, more to herself than to him. "What do you expect me to do with this information?" Jesse's gaze softened just enough for her to catch it. He set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his trousers, his attention now fully on her. "Nothing. You don't have to do anything. But when it all comes to light, you'll understand why I had to be here." Kate's heart skipped a beat at the weight in his words. There was more to him than he let on, more than the outlaw persona, more than the gunfighter that everyone whispered about. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that helping him would only make things worse. But the pull inside her, it was there, strong and undeniable. "I'm not sure I trust you," she said, her voice quieter now. She wasn't asking for answers, not yet, but she needed to hear something from him that would convince her to let down her guard. Jesse straightened, his mouth tugging into something between a smile and a grimace. "I'm not asking you to," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here for you to trust me, Kate. I'm here for my own reasons." The room seemed to grow smaller, the space between them tight and charged. Kate held his gaze, feeling that same pull deepen. Her mind screamed for caution, for distance, but something in her, something she didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to take a step closer. "I don't like being in the dark," she said finally, breaking the silence. "And I don't like being dragged into things I can't control." Jesse nodded slowly, his gaze steady and calculating. "I get it, and I'm not trying to drag you into anything, but if you want to keep your saloon standing, you might just find yourself in the middle of this whether you like it or not." Kate's heart pounded as his words sank in. She didn't know if he was playing her or if there was more to him than she could see. But one thing was clear, she was already tangled in something bigger than her own concerns, and Jesse Calloway had just made it clear that he wasn't about to let her back out. The tension between them tightened. She tried to fight it, tried to remind herself that trusting him would be dangerous, but the pull inside her refused to go away. And when Jessie looked at her again, she felt the weight of a choice she wasn't ready to make. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty rising in her chest. "Maybe I don't have a choice." Jessie's eyes softened, just a fraction, and for a brief moment there was something real between them, something more than just two people caught in a game of survival. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had come. He nodded, his voice a little softer now. "We're all just trying to survive, Kate. Some of us have just been doing it longer than others." Kate didn't respond. She couldn't. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the promise of whatever came next. And as the days stretched on, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jessie was just the beginning of a much larger story. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over Silver Creek. It had been a long day of sorting through the aftermath of the fight, and Kate was ready to breathe some fresh air. She stepped outside the saloon and made her way toward the stables, the familiar sound of hoofs and the smell of leather and hay giving her some comfort. The horses were her only solace in a town that felt like it was closing in on her from all sides. She moved toward the stable doors, but before she could reach them, a voice cut through the quiet. "Mercer." Kate froze, her heart sinking as she recognized the voice. She didn't have to turn to know it was Horace Wheeler. His thick, drawling tone was unmistakable, the kind of voice that oozed with smug confidence and thinly veiled menace. She turned slowly, her gaze locking with his as he approached, flanked by his usual two burly men. Wheeler's eyes were hard, like stones worn smooth by years of backroom deals and intimidation. His wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but it did little to hide the sneer tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Didn't think I'd find you out here, all alone," he said, his voice slick with mock sweetness. "Thought maybe you'd be holed up inside counting your whiskey profits." Kate didn't respond immediately. She didn't have to. She could feel the tension between them thickening, like smoke in a small room. Wheeler had been sniffing around for a while now, trying to get his hands on her saloon, and his patience was wearing thin. "You've made your point, Wheeler," Kate said coolly, crossing her arms over her chest. "I'm not sellin'," he chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "Oh, I think you will. You see, I'm a patient man, but my patience is run out." He stepped closer, the dust beneath his boots crunching with each deliberate step. "The way I see it, you've got two choices. Sell to me, or keep running that little hole in the wall and deal with the consequences." Kate's eyes narrowed as she stood her ground. "And what consequences are those? More threats? More empty promises?" Wheeler's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got a knack for making things difficult, don't you, Kate? Let me make it easy for you." He pulled a thick envelope from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the nearby fence post with a sharp flick of his wrist. The envelope, fat with cash, landed softly, almost invitingly. "I'm willing to pay handsomely for what's yours, more money than you've seen in years. You wouldn't even have to work another day." Kate's gaze flicked to the envelope, but she didn't move. The temptation was there. She'd be lying if she said she hadn't thought about it, but she wasn't some pawn to be bought and sold, not even by a man like Wheeler. "I don't want your money, Wheeler," she said firmly, her voice low and steady. "This place means something to me. I'm not selling out." The smile slipped from his face like a mask, revealing the edge of frustration behind it. He stepped closer, his eyes cold now with a venomous edge. "You're making a big mistake. You keep associating with outlaws like Jesse Calloway, and you'll find yourself in a real bind. A woman like you can't afford the kind of trouble he brings. Trust me, I've seen men like him before. They don't just walk away when the dust settles." Kate felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of Jesse's name, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't about to let Wheeler use her feelings for Jesse against her. He was pushing all the wrong buttons, trying to rattle her, but she'd been rattled enough in her life to know when to stand firm. "I'm not the one you should be worried about," she said evenly, meeting his gaze head on. "If you've got a problem with Jesse, then take it up with him. But don't come here trying to scare me into selling. It ain't gonna work." Wheeler's eyes narrowed and his lips curled into a tight, thin smile. "Oh, it'll work eventually," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Kate. You don't know what kind of people I've got on my side." But that's all right. You'll find out soon enough." He stepped back, his eyes glinting with the kind of threat that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. He was like a snake, coiled and ready to strike. "Don't say I didn't warn you, though," he added, his tone hardening. "I always get what I want." With that, Wheeler turned and walked away, his men following close behind, leaving Kate standing there with a growing sense of unease. The door to the stables swung on its hinges in the wind, the sound of the metal clinking like the dull echo of a warning. Kate's heart raced in her chest as she stared after him, her thoughts a blur. She knew she was up against more than just Wheeler. Coldwell's grip on the town was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before the sheriff's hand would be forced. The pressure was mounting. She was beginning to feel the weight of the situation, the suffocating sense of being cornered on all sides. Wheeler, Coldwell, and Jesse, none of them were easy players. And Kate couldn't figure out whether she was swimming with the current or fighting against it. She turned back to the horses, her breath coming in short bursts as the reality of what she was facing settled in. This wasn't just a fight to keep her saloon, it was a fight to keep her life the way she wanted it. And if Wheeler thought he could push her around, he had another thing coming. Kate reached out and stroked the horse's mane, trying to calm her nerves. But deep down, she knew one thing for sure. The game was changing, and she had no choice but to keep playing. Silver Creek had a way of feeling different when the sheriff rode in. The air grew heavier as though the land itself tensed up, waiting for something bad to happen. Sheriff Coldwell's arrival was always like that, an unwelcome storm rolling in, dark and foreboding. Kate stood behind the bar, wiping down the counter, trying to ignore the gnawing unease in her gut. The Painted Rose was quieter than usual, the late afternoon lull setting in. A few men were still nursing their drinks, but they were too busy eyeing the door. They knew what was coming. Coldwell wasn't one to just stroll in and chat. The bell above the door jingled sharply, and Kate didn't even need to look up to know who had walked in. It was the kind of silence that only a man like Coldwell could carry with him. His polished boots clacked against the wooden floor as he stepped inside, tall and imposing in his neat pressed uniform. His sheriff's star gleamed under the dim light, making it stand out against the rustic surroundings like a glaring reminder of the law's heavy hand. Kate didn't flinch as he approached. She kept her back straight, focusing on the task at hand, though the tension in the room was thick enough to slice. She knew the drill. Coldwell didn't come here for pleasantries. He was here to make sure things went the way he wanted, whether people liked it or not. Coldwell's eyes scanned the room with a sharpness that felt invasive. When they finally landed on her, the scrutiny was unmistakable. He tipped his hat in a stiff greeting, his eyes narrowing. "Ms. Mercer," he said, his voice low, cold, and deliberate. "Heard there's been some trouble here." Kate didn't acknowledge the comment right away, though her jaw tightened. She set the rag down and met his gaze with the same steely resolve she always wore when dealing with men like him. "The usual kind. Drunk men, a bit of a scuffle, nothing we couldn't handle." Coldwell took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He was tall, his shoulders broad under his uniform, the lines of his face etched with years of hard decisions. "I'm not talking about drunk fools, Miss Mercer," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I'm talking about the kind of trouble that's been stirring up since that man Calloway walked through your door." Kate's stomach tightened. She felt the words like a cold wind against her skin, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff," she said, her tone even, though a flicker of something passed through her chest. "Jesse Calloway's just another customer. He hasn't caused any trouble." Coldwell's lips curled into something that barely resembled a smile. "Calloway," he repeated, savoring the name like a bad taste. "Outlaw. Wanted for a whole mess of things. Robberies, murders, the usual. I'd say you're keeping some mighty bad company, Ms. Mercer." Kate's fingers twitched on the rag. She knew what he was getting at. He'd been circling around this for weeks now, trying to pressure her into making a choice. But he wasn't going to scare her. Not yet. She straightened, her voice steady. "I'm not responsible for who walks through my doors, Sheriff. If you've got a problem with him, take it up with him." Coldwell stepped closer still, his boots dragging the weight of authority across the worn floor. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here, Ms. Mercer. You're protecting him, and you're putting yourself in the middle of something you can't control." His voice dropped even lower, carrying the weight of a threat that hung in the air like a storm. "I'm not one for patience, and I won't let your little saloon stand in the way of what's right." Kate's heart thudded in her chest, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She met his eyes, unflinching. "I don't take kindly to threats, Sheriff. Not from you or anyone else." Caldwell leaned in just a bit closer, his face a little too close to hers now, his breath mixing with the stale air of the saloon. His eyes burned into hers with a cold intensity. "Let me make it plain for you, Miss Mercer," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "You can get rid of Calloway, or you can start dealing with the consequences. I'm giving you a chance to get out of this clean. Don't make me regret it." Kate's pulse quickened, but she stood firm. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to scare her, trying to make her bend. But she wasn't going to be bullied, not by him, and not by anyone. "You think I'm going to throw out a man who saved my place?" she shot back, her words sharp. "You can try all you want, Sheriff, but it won't work." Caldwell's gaze hardened, and for a moment, the silence between them felt as heavy as a boulder. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "No one stands against the law in Silver Creek, Ms. Mercer. Not even you." With that, he straightened up, tipping his hat in a mock salute. "Think about what I said," he added, his voice calm again, but with an undertone of menace that would linger long after he left. "I'll be around, and I'm not the kind of man who forgets." Kate didn't move as Caldwell turned on his heel and walked out of the saloon, his men trailing behind him. The bell above the door jingled softly, leaving the room with a heavy silence in its wake. Kate stared after him for a long moment, her chest tight with a mix of anger and unease. She'd known it was coming. The sheriff had always had a hand in everything in Silver Creek, but this felt different. Caldwell's words, the way he'd leaned in so close, she could feel the weight of them sinking deep. Jesse Calloway had been a wild card she hadn't wanted to deal with, but now the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about the saloon anymore. Caldwell's warning was a reminder that in Silver Creek, loyalty to the wrong people could cost you everything. Kate turned away from the door, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was starting to realize just how much danger she was really in. And as much as she wanted to walk away, she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. The storm was coming, and there was no way out of it. The night dragged on in Silver Creek like a slow-moving river, the weight of the day hanging heavy on Kate's chest. The saloon had emptied out hours ago, and the quiet of the place felt too thick, too oppressive. The usual sounds of laughter and clinking glasses had faded, leaving only the soft creaks of the building as the wind outside pushed against the walls. Kate couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It was in the air, heavy and thick with the promise of change, of something she couldn't control. She paced the floor, her boots clicking sharply against the wood, the same restless energy coursing through her veins. Her thoughts were tangled, circling around Jesse. He had come to Silver Creek as an outlaw, but there was something in him, something that didn't fit the image. She had trusted him, maybe too easily. But now, with Sheriff Caldwell's growing presence, she wondered if she had misjudged him. The door to the saloon creaked open, and Kate's eyes snapped to the figure standing in the doorway. Jesse. He stood there for a moment, his silhouette framed by the dim light outside, his hat in hand and his coat collar turned up against the night air. His presence filled the room, as it always did, steady, like a rock. But tonight there was something different, something final in the way he stood there, watching her. Kate's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face steady, hiding the emotions roiling inside. She hadn't expected him to show up tonight, not after the way things had gone earlier. The tension from the sheriff's visit still hung in the air like a bad smell. "You're leaving," she said, her voice tight, trying to keep the hurt out of it. Jesse didn't answer right away. He stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. His eyes lingered on her for a beat longer than necessary, but there was no warmth in them, not like before. He wasn't here to explain, he was here to end it. The sheriff's been sniffing around, he said, his voice low, controlled. Things are getting too hot for me to stay. It's not safe for either of us, Kate. For your sake, I've got to go. Kate's pulse quickened, a sharp pain settling in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd felt the sting of betrayal, but this one felt different. It felt personal. You just gonna leave? Just like that? She shot back, her words sharper than she intended. She stood straighter, her posture defensive, though her heart was anything but steady. After everything that's happened, you walk in here, make yourself part of my life, and now you're just gonna walk out? Jesse hesitated, a flicker of something, guilt, passing across his face. It's for the best. It's getting too dangerous around here. I can't let you get caught up in it. Her breath caught, and she crossed the room in quick strides, her heart pounding against her ribs. Don't talk to me like I'm some helpless little girl who needs protecting, she snapped, her voice breaking despite her effort to stay strong. I'm not scared of whatever trouble you've got with the sheriff, but I am damn tired of being treated like I don't have a say in this. Jesse's eyes softened, but he didn't move closer. He stood there, distant, as if there was a wall between them that neither one of them knew how to break down. I'm not leaving because I want to, Kate, he said quietly. I'm leaving because I have to. The law's getting too close, and if you keep associating with me, you'll be in danger too. Stop, Kate said, shaking her head. You don't get to make that decision for me. You don't get to just walk away and think it's the easy way out. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. She didn't want to feel this way, didn't want to care, but the ache in her chest, the bitter taste of his departure, was too much to ignore. She'd let herself get too close, too attached, and now it was too late to turn back. Jesse's gaze softened, but it didn't reach his voice. I'm not trying to hurt you, Kate. I'm trying to keep you safe. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the tension building in her chest like a storm. By leaving? By disappearing? Her voice wavered, but she didn't back down. You think running away is going to solve anything? Jesse stepped forward, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air between them felt thick with unspoken things that neither of them knew how to say. I don't have a choice, he said, his voice rough now. If I stay, I'll bring more trouble than you can handle. Kate's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to admit it, but a part of her, the part that had hoped, that had let herself believe, was already starting to break. She didn't want to let him go, not like this, not without understanding. You're wrong, she said, her voice quiet now, more uncertain. I can handle myself, but I don't know how to handle losing you. The words hung between them like a confession, raw and unguarded. Jess's face tightened at her words, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. I never wanted to drag you into this, he finally said, his voice lower now, almost regretful. But if you're asking me to stay, I can't. Not without putting you in danger. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Kate's heart was beating so loudly she could hardly hear herself think. She wanted to scream, to tell him to stay, to tell him that she didn't care about the danger. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she took a step back, her shoulders slumping under the weight of his words. Then go, she said, her voice soft but firm, the fight gone from it. If you think that's what's best for me, then go. Jesse didn't say anything at first. His jaw clenched as he looked at her, his eyes haunted with a mixture of regret and something else, something Kate couldn't name. But then he nodded slowly, once, before turning toward the door. I'll see you around, Kate, he said quietly, the words heavier than they should have been. And with that, he stepped into the night, leaving her standing there, alone in the silence that followed. Kate stood there for a long moment, her chest aching, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she hadn't been able to make. She told herself she was angry. She told herself it was for the best, but deep down, she knew the truth. She'd already lost him. The saloon was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. Kate sat at the back of the room, her back to the bar, with a glass of whiskey in hand, though she wasn't really drinking. The amber liquid sat untouched, a mirror of the restlessness that had been gnawing at her for days. Outside, the sun had set, leaving behind a canvas of bruised purple and gold. The fading light filtered through the cracks in the wooden blinds, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. Kate didn't notice the time slipping by. Her thoughts were too tangled. Her mind kept circling back to Jesse, his departure, his words, the way he had left without so much as a second glance. It was almost like he'd never been there at all. But there was something she couldn't shake. Something he'd said about the danger in Silver Creek, the law, and the people who didn't want her to know the truth. She pushed herself up from the table, needing to move, to do anything to drown out the thoughts that kept creeping in. Her fingers brushed the edge of the bar as she walked past, and she noticed the familiar glint of her mother's locket resting on the counter. She hadn't thought about it in weeks, not since the chaos of the past few days had taken over her mind, but now it caught her attention like a whisper in the dark. Kate picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate gold chain before slowly unfastening the clasp. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing a faded photograph tucked inside. She had always known it was there, but she hadn't looked at it in so long. Her mother had left it to her when she passed, and Kate had always assumed it was just a simple keepsake, a memento of a time long gone. But as she peered down at the image, something about it stopped her cold. The photo was old, worn at the edges, the ink faded and unclear in places. But there was no mistaking the face staring back at her. A man with dark eyes, a strong jawline, and a hardened expression. He was dressed in a faded suit, his hair slicked back, but it was the eyes that caught her. The eyes that seemed to look right through her. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd seen those eyes before. She reached for the edge of the bar to steady herself, her hands shaking. The man in the photograph bore an uncanny resemblance to someone Kate had only ever heard about in hushed whispers. An infamous outlaw who had been active in the region years before she was born. A man known for his ruthlessness, for the violence that followed him like a shadow. Could it be him? Could this man, this stranger, be her father? Kate's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing as she stared at the photo. She'd always wondered about her heritage, about the father she had never known. Her mother had kept quiet about him, had rarely mentioned his name, and Kate had grown up with the strange feeling of an empty space inside her, a hole that couldn't be filled with anything. She had never known why her mother had never spoken about him, never given her any answers. But now, standing in the dim light of the saloon, Kate felt the weight of that silence fall on her like a rock. This revelation hit her like a freight train. Her mind spun with questions, the answers just out of reach. Had her father really been the outlaw they said he was? Had he left her mother behind, or had something else happened to him? And what did this mean for her saloon, for everything she thought she knew about her own life? She turned the locket over in her hands, the cold metal pressing into her palm. There was no mistaking the implications of this discovery. Could this hidden piece of her past have any bearing on the danger she faced now? The pressure from men like Horace Wheeler? The sheriff's threats? Jesse's sudden departure? All of it felt tied to something bigger than just the saloon. The picture stared back at her, unyielding, as if daring her to uncover the truth. Kate didn't know whether to feel anger, betrayal, or something else entirely. She didn't know whether to tear the locket apart or keep it locked away forever. What had her mother kept from her all these years, and why? The sudden crash of a chair breaking the silence startled her. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until now. Kate's hand flew to her chest, her heart racing, but the panic faded as she looked down at the locket again. She swallowed hard, setting the locket back on the bar. Her mind raced with the implications of this discovery, her thoughts too jumbled to form any clear answers. But one thing was certain. The truth about her past was more complicated than she'd ever imagined, and whatever secrets it held, they were going to lead her straight into the heart of the danger she'd been trying to avoid. She took a deep breath, her hand steadying now as she closed the locket and slipped it into her pocket. There was no turning back now. She didn't know what it all meant yet, but she had a feeling that her father's legacy, and whatever trouble it brought with it, was going to catch up to her sooner rather than later. And as the night settled around her, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only just beginning. The saloon was quieter than it had been in days, the steady buzz of voices and clinking glasses replaced by a heavy silence. Kate sat at the bar, her fingers tracing the rim of her whiskey glass absent-mindedly. The dim light from the hanging lanterns cast long shadows across the room, and the warm amber glow reflected off the polished wood of the bar. Her mind, however, was far from the peaceful solitude of the moment. She had been holding on to the locket all evening, her hand slipping in and out of her pocket as though it might reveal something more with every touch. The photo inside still haunted her, the man who could be her father, his eyes cold and distant, a reflection of a past she hadn't known. But now that image wasn't just a piece of a forgotten history, it was something more. Kate leaned back in her chair, her thoughts spinning. Her life, up until this point, had been about survival, keeping the Painted Rose open, facing down threats from men like Wheeler, and staying ahead of the sheriff's watchful eye. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that her father's legacy, whatever it had been, was tied to the very same dangers she was facing now. The locket had once been a comforting relic, a piece of her mother's past that she could wear close to her heart. But it wasn't just that anymore. It was a key, a link to something she hadn't even begun to understand, something bigger than herself. Her fingers clenched around the small locket in her pocket as a realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. Her father's past wasn't as irrelevant as she had once believed. He wasn't just a ghost from a forgotten time. He might be the missing piece of a puzzle she had no idea she was even trying to solve. Silver Creek had its share of secrets, and the more Kate thought about it, the more she realized that her family's tangled history could be tied up in the very heart of the town's corruption. Wheeler's greed, Coldwell's threats. It wasn't just about the Painted Rose. There was something deeper, something hidden, and it all pointed back to her father. The man in the photograph was no mere outlaw. He was part of something far bigger. Kate let out a slow breath. She didn't know how, but she knew one thing now. This was no longer just about keeping her saloon. This was about uncovering the truth. Her father had left her a trail, and she was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of hooves on the dirt road outside, followed by the familiar creak of the saloon's door. The cold evening air swept into the room for a brief moment, but Kate didn't turn to look. She was too lost in the storm of her own mind, the questions swirling around her like a whirlwind. She couldn't afford to let distractions take over, especially not when she was so close to understanding something that could change everything. With a decisive motion, Kate pushed the whiskey aside. She wasn't sure if it was the liquor or the weight of the decisions ahead, but her mind had cleared. This new purpose, finding the truth about her father, gave her strength, gave her the resolve to face what was coming. But even as she embraced this new path, a flicker of doubt gnawed at her. She couldn't help but think about Jesse. His sudden departure had left her shaken, and the unanswered questions about him lingered in the back of her mind. His presence had thrown everything into sharp relief, and now that he was gone, it felt like a piece of her own puzzle had been ripped away. Would he return? And if he did, would it be to finish what he started, or to run again from the shadows of his past? Kate shook her head, trying to shake the thought away. She didn't have time for distractions. Not now. She had work to do, and it would take all of her focus to unravel the mystery of her father's past. Her fingers slipped back into her pocket, the cool metal of the locket pressing against her skin. Whatever happened next, she had a plan. She wasn't going to let the shadows of her past, or anyone else's, hold her back. The road ahead wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. Kate Mercer wasn't going to let anything stop her from finding the truth. Not the sheriff, not Wheeler, and certainly not the ghosts of a past she hadn't known existed. Silver Creek had its secrets, but she would dig them up, one way or another. The town had taken too much from her already. Now it was time for her to take something back. Part 2. The early morning light was weak, barely making it through the grimy windows of the Painted Rose. Kate stepped softly across the saloon floor, the wood creaking under her boots like the old bones of a tired man. She could feel the weight of the night before settling on her shoulders. The fight, the threats. Silver Creek had a way of wearing you down, making you feel like you were always a step behind. But the saloon was still standing, and for all the wreckage, there was a resilience in the air. The Painted Rose had seen worse days, and so had she. Her eyes scanned the room. Chairs were askew, one of the tables had a noticeable crack in it, and a few bottles had been knocked off the shelf. But nothing that couldn't be fixed. The saloon's spirit was intact. Kate's spirit, though, was a different matter. She moved behind the bar, the familiar weight of the wood under her palms a small comfort in the chaos. The rag she picked up was worn, like everything in this place, but it did its job. She wiped the counter in long, steady strokes, each movement almost mechanical as she thought about what needed to be done, the choice she had to make. There were no easy answers, only the promise of more trouble, more danger. The soft rustle of paper interrupted her thoughts. She glanced down and saw the letter, lying there like a confession she wasn't ready to read. Jesse's handwriting, rough and hurried, just like him. She hadn't wanted to deal with it, hadn't wanted to know what he had to say, but it had been sitting there all night, staring at her like a challenge. Kate ran her fingers across the envelope, feeling the edges of the paper, wondering if she was ready for whatever lay inside. A part of her wanted to throw it in the fire, forget he'd ever written it, and keep moving forward with the life she knew. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the warmth of his presence, the feeling of being seen for the first time in years, knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. With a slow breath, she tore open the envelope and pulled out the crumpled note. The ink was smudged in places, the words rushed, but they were still legible. You were right to doubt me, but there's more to Silver Creek than you think. Watch your back. I'll be back when the time is right. Kate stared at the note for a long moment. The words didn't sit right with her. Too vague, too evasive. A cold lump formed in her chest as the anger she'd been suppressing bubbled to the surface. He had left again. Disappeared like he always did, and now he expected her to just wait for him? Wait for when the time is right? Her hands clenched around the paper, but she didn't tear it in half. She couldn't. She felt the flutter in her heart, the way his words still had power over her, even after everything. But she wasn't going to let him run the show anymore. Jesse Calloway might have had his reasons, but Kate wasn't in the business of waiting anymore. Silver Creek was a town of secrets and shadows, and she wasn't going to let it swallow her whole. Not without a fight. She set the note down on the bar, her fingers still trembling as the anger settled into something colder. Determination. He wanted her to watch her back? Fine, she would. But she wouldn't do it from the sidelines, waiting for someone else to save her. She had her own fight to fight now, one that didn't need Jesse to be the hero. Kate squared her shoulders and looked around the saloon. The familiar smells of whiskey, tobacco, and dust mixed in the air, but there was something different about it today. It wasn't just the saloon she was fighting for. It was her own future, her own legacy. She wasn't going to let Wheeler, Coldwell, or anyone else drag her down. Not this time. She made her way to the back office, grabbing the letter as she passed, tucking it into her pocket like a reminder of what she was up against. As she stood by the desk, looking at the small, weathered maps of the town, a new fire burned in her chest. There were secrets here, hidden in plain sight. Her father's legacy, whatever it might be, was tied up in those secrets. And she was going to find them. Silver Creek had always tried to crush her, tried to take everything from her, but this time, she wasn't going to wait for anyone. She was going to cross the threshold, face whatever came her way, and take control of her own destiny. The door to the saloon creaked open, and Kate didn't flinch. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She could feel the air change when he walked in. But this time, it wasn't Jesse. It was a man who had been in the background of her life for far too long. Wheeler. He stood there, leaning against the doorframe, a smug grin already curling at his lips. Kate didn't have time for his games, not today, not anymore. I see you're still standing, Wheeler said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. Thought for sure you'd be running scared by now. Kate turned toward him, her eyes steely, her voice low and controlled. I've got no intention of running, Wheeler. Not now, not ever. His grin faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. You're making a big mistake, you know that? Kate didn't respond. She didn't need to. The decision had been made. She was done waiting, done being pushed around. Whether Jesse came back or not, this fight was hers now. I'm done talking, she said, her voice sharp. You'll get your answer soon enough. and it won't be the one you're expecting." Wheeler paused, a glint of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected this from her. But Kate didn't care. She had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back now. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Kate Mercer felt certain of one thing. It was time to fight back. The early morning light was weak, barely filtering through the grime-smeared windows of the painted rows. The town outside was still half asleep, but inside, the saloon felt like a place stuck between two worlds, between the past and whatever storm was coming. Kate was behind the bar, scrubbing the counter with a worn rag, trying to find something to focus on, other than the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in her gut. The heavy thud of boots on the wooden floor brought her head up. The door swung open, letting in a blast of cold morning air, and there he stood, Sheriff Coldwell. He had that look, the one that said he didn't care who he pissed off, so long as he got what he wanted. Kate felt the weight of his presence before he even spoke, and she didn't need to look up to know what was coming. The creak of his boots as he approached the bar was a familiar sound, heavy, deliberate. His polished uniform gleamed under the dim light, a sharp contrast to the rough around the edges town and its people. Coldwell's eyes narrowed as they met hers, his expression always the same, patronizing, dismissive, like she was just another piece of the puzzle he was controlling. She straightened, her shoulders squaring as she met his gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. He didn't scare her, but there was no denying the pressure he carried with him. "Morning, Ms. Mercer," Coldwell said, his voice smooth, but the weight of his authority slid into each word like a slow knife. "Thought I'd stop by and check on things, make sure everything's in order." Kate gritted her teeth, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just another morning, Sheriff, same as any other." Coldwell leaned against the bar, his elbow resting on the worn wood with a casual ease that only someone in his position could pull off. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on everything but her. When he turned back, there was that same cold, assessing look in his eyes. "You know," he said slowly, his words dripping with meaning, "the law's been watching you, watching this place." He paused, the air between them thick with the unsaid. "Harboring a man like Jesse Calloway, that'll put a target on your back." Kate's fingers tightened around the rag, the coarse fabric biting into her palm. She could feel his eyes on her, too close, too searching, like he was digging through her bones for something he could use. His presence made her skin crawl, but she kept her voice steady, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. "I'm not harboring anyone, Sheriff. Just a man with a drink and a seat at the bar," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Coldwell's lips twitched into a smile that never reached his eyes. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" he murmured, his gaze lingering longer this time, a little too much for her liking. "But let me make it clear for you, Miss Mercer. You're not above the law, and if you keep turning a blind eye to the kind of company you're keeping, you'll regret it. The consequences won't just be on you, they'll be on this whole damn town." Kate fought to keep her breath steady, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. "I won't be bullied, Sheriff." Coldwell's eyes gleamed as if he found something amusing in her defiance. "I'm not asking you to back down," he said softly, almost in mock sympathy. "I'm just letting you know, Miss Mercer, the law will be watching, and I'm not the only one who'll be keeping an eye on you. You keep him around, and you're going to find out just how high the price will be." Kate's hand slid slowly down the bar, her fingers brushing the worn surface. There was a fire inside her now, a spark that didn't flare but burned with quiet intensity. Coldwell didn't intimidate her, not like he thought he did. He was just another man with too much power and not enough sense to know when he'd pushed someone too far. "Maybe I'll take my chances," Kate said, her voice low and steady. Coldwell took a step closer, leaning in just enough to make sure his words cut through the silence. "I don't think you understand how far I'll go to put things right. You'll regret making this a game, Miss Mercer." She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "You're all talk, Sheriff." Coldwell's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as if she'd hit a nerve, but he only gave a short, humorless laugh and straightened up. "Maybe. But I'll make sure you know what happens when someone crosses me." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, the sound of his boots heavy against the wooden floor, like a threat trailing behind him. The door swung open, letting in the last bite of cold morning air before it slammed shut. Kate was left alone with the weight of his threat, the tension lingering in the air long after he was gone. She stood still for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind was already racing. Coldwell had made his move, and now it was her turn. She wasn't going to let him push her around. Not now. Not ever. The saloon was quiet again, but it wasn't the same as before. It felt smaller, somehow. She moved behind the bar, locking her fingers around the edge of the counter. There was no turning back from this. The sheriff was right about one thing. This wasn't a game. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. With a sharp breath, Kate grabbed the keys to the door and moved to the back. She locked the saloon doors one by one, the sound of each click echoing in the silence. When she was finished, she stood there for a moment, the weight of the decisions ahead settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about protecting the Painted Rose anymore. It was about protecting herself and her place in this damn town. Kate Mercer was done being pushed around, and she was going to fight, no matter who came for her. The sun was starting to set, casting a rich amber glow over Silver Creek. The town's dirt roads were quiet for now, the usual bustle stilled by the creeping threat of the coming night. Inside the Painted Rose, the mood was different. Heavy, charged, but not quite hopeless. Kate sat at a table in the back corner of the saloon, her elbows resting on the scarred wood, her fingers drumming a slow beat as she listened. Across from her sat Mrs. McKinley, the schoolteacher, and old Sam, the blacksmith. They had been the few in town who had offered quiet support since Kate's uncle passed. They were the ones who had shared warnings about Wheeler, the ones who had whispered bits of town gossip that didn't fit the official story. Kate had come to trust them, though she always kept her guard up. In a town like Silver Creek, trust was a currency she didn't spend lightly. "Tell me what you know," Kate said, her voice low, as she glanced from Mrs. McKinley to Sam, her expression tight. "Everything." Mrs. McKinley glanced around the saloon before leaning in, her eyes darting nervously. The schoolteacher wasn't young anymore, her bones were tired and her mind sharp as ever, but she knew the risks of speaking too freely in this town. Kat could see the worry in her face, the way she held her hands clasped tightly together on the table. "It's not just the sheriff," Mrs. McKinley said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words edged with caution. "There are men in town who want to turn this place into something worse, a haven for outlaws. Wheeler and his gang." She paused, glancing nervously at the door before continuing. "I saw the sheriff with Wheeler late one night, down by the old mill. They were exchanging money, whispers of deals that go far beyond whiskey and poker." Kate's chest tightened as she listened. Coldwell and Wheeler. She had suspected something was amiss between the two, but hearing it from Mrs. McKinley, seeing the old woman's quiet fear, made it all the more real. Her fingers tightened around her glass, the coldness of the whiskey sharp against her skin. Mrs. McKinley's voice dropped further, and she leaned in close. "They were talking about the Painted Rose, Kate. Your place. They're planning something big. I don't know all the details, but I know enough to know you're in danger." Sam grunted, his thick hands resting on the edge of his chair, his voice rough from years of hammering steel. "Wheeler's been playing the long game," he muttered. "But I've heard whispers. If they get what they want, your saloon, the land, it'll be more than just a business takeover. This town's going to turn into a den for criminals." Kate felt a cold knot settle in her stomach. She had known it was coming. Something darker was on the horizon. But hearing it from them, from people she trusted, felt like a slap to the face. It wasn't just a rivalry between the sheriff and Wheeler. It was a plan, a scheme to take control of everything. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers still clutched around the glass, and looked at them both, her mind already racing with the possibilities. "You're saying Coldwell is in on it? He's helping Wheeler?" Mrs. McKinley nodded solemnly. "Not just helping. He's part of it. That's why the law's been tightening around you. It's not just about Jesse Calloway. It's about silencing anyone who stands in their way." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing with concern. You're a threat to them now, Kate. A woman with a place in this town. A woman who doesn't bow down to them? They don't like that. Kate felt the truth of her words settle deep in her chest. She'd always known the sheriff had a hand in things, but to hear it laid out like this, with the added weight of Wheeler's involvement, made everything feel much worse. The Painted Rose wasn't just a bar. It was the last foothold of independence in a town that was slipping into corruption. We can't let this happen, Kate muttered, more to herself than to them, but they heard her. Sam shifted in his chair, his weathered face hardening. The town's been under Caldwell's thumb for too long, but there are others who aren't happy with what he's doing. You ain't alone in this. Kate's eyes met his. The blacksmith wasn't just talking about himself, he was talking about the few remaining people in town who still had a sense of right and wrong, people who hadn't been bought off. It gave her a little hope, but the fear still gnawed at her insides. Mrs. McKinley reached across the table, placing a hand over Kate's. You need to be careful, dear. The sheriff's not one to give up easily, and neither is Wheeler. They'll do anything to keep their hold on Silver Creek. Kate straightened, her resolve hardening. She had known the stakes, but now they were laid out before her in black and white. It wasn't just about saving her saloon. It was about standing up to a corrupt system, about protecting what was hers. I'm not backing down, Kate said, her voice sharp with the kind of finality that could only come from a woman who had fought for every scrap of ground she'd ever had. I won't let them take this town or my place in it. I'll find a way to stop them, even if it means standing alone. Mrs. McKinley's expression softened, a faint smile pulling at her lips. You're not alone, Kate. Not now, not ever. We'll stand with you. We'll make sure this town knows there's still a chance. Sam gave a rough chuckle, the sound deep and gravelly. You're going to need more than whiskey to get through this, but we'll make sure you've got all the help you need. Kate's chest tightened with something that felt like gratitude, mixed with the sting of uncertainty. She couldn't do this alone, but she wasn't about to run from the fight either. Whatever the sheriff and Wheeler had planned, she would meet it head on. She would uncover their secrets, expose them for what they were, and when the time came, she would strike back. Thank you, Kate said, her voice low but firm. I won't forget this. The silence that settled over the table was thick with understanding. The fight wasn't just hers anymore. The townsfolk, the ones who still cared about Silver Creek, had begun to see her as their ally. Together, they might just have a chance. She stood up, her shoulders square, her back straight. There was work to be done. Silver Creek had its darkness, but Kate Mercer was ready to face it. The saloon was alive with the usual evening buzz. Laughter and the clink of glasses filled the air, the scent of tobacco and whiskey thickening as the crowd grew. The wooden floor creaked under the boots of rowdy patrons who had spilled in for a drink or two after a long day of work. Kate stood behind the bar, her hands steady on the wood as she moved through the motions of serving drinks, though her mind was elsewhere, lost in the tangled mess of decisions she had to make. Then the door opened with a familiar jingle of the bell, and all at once the noise in the room seemed to shift. She didn't need to look up to know who had entered. His presence was like a ripple in the air, unsettling and magnetic. Jesse Calloway walked in, his dark coat sweeping the floor behind him like a shadow. His face was unreadable, hard, but his eyes, those eyes, locked onto hers with a quick flash of recognition before he turned his attention elsewhere. He didn't approach the bar. Instead, he gave a brief nod and made his way to a quiet corner, a spot far removed from the chaos of the crowd. Kate felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she forced herself to look away, to pretend she didn't feel the weight of his gaze on her. The patrons were mostly unaware of the tension that had arrived with Jesse. They were too busy trading insults and laughter, their voices rising and falling like the ebb and flow of a river. But Kate couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now, that his return meant something she wasn't ready to face. Minutes ticked by, but they felt like hours. Kate busied herself behind the bar, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Her mind raced with questions, with the strange mix of anger and relief that came with seeing Jesse again. She couldn't explain it, but she knew one thing: she wasn't about to let him slip away this time. She grabbed a glass, filled it with whiskey, and walked toward the corner where Jesse had settled. He didn't look up as she approached, his eyes staring into his drink as if it could provide the answers he needed. She stopped a few feet away, and the space between them felt charged, thick with the things neither of them had said. Her voice broke the silence, sharp and cautious. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Jesse didn't move, didn't shift in his chair. He just stared into his glass, his jaw clenched tight. "You shouldn't be involved, Kate. This is more dangerous than you think." Her heart skipped a beat, but she refused to let him see the impact of his words. She wasn't some helpless woman who needed rescuing. "I can take care of myself, Jesse," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. "I've survived worse than you, and I sure as hell don't need your protection." He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "This isn't about protection," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Coldwell and Wheeler have deep roots in this town. They've been working together for years, building something you don't want any part of, your saloon. It's central to their plans. Coldwell wants to turn this place into a base for his operations." Kate's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the weight of his words sinking in. "They want to take over my saloon? This place is mine, Jesse. I won't let them have it." Jesse's gaze softened, but there was no pity in his eyes, only the hard, cold truth. "It's not just about your saloon, it's about control. Wheeler's been making deals with men like Coldwell, men who'll stop at nothing to turn this town into a den for criminals. You're in their way, and they won't let that slide." Kate's hands tightened around the glass she was still holding, the cold of the whiskey seeping through her fingertips. She wasn't afraid, but there was a fire burning deep in her chest now, the kind of fire that came from a lifetime of fighting. "My father didn't raise a coward," she snapped, her voice rising with the weight of her defiance. "I'm not afraid of them. I won't let them have this town, this saloon. I've fought too hard for everything I've got." Jesse's face softened, but it was fleeting, replaced by that same hard determination she had seen when he walked through the door. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and looked at her like he was trying to see through her. "You don't understand, Kate. They're not just after your saloon. They're after everything. They'll break you to get what they want, and I can't stand by and watch that happen." Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that she could handle it, but the truth was starting to sink in. He wasn't just warning her. He was trying to protect her in his own way. But Kate wasn't looking for a savior. She wasn't going to run or hide, not from him, not from anyone. She stepped closer, her eyes burning with the fire of someone who had seen too many things lost and wasn't going to lose anything else. "I'm not afraid of them, Jesse. I'm not backing down." The tension between them crackled like a wire ready to snap, but before either of them could say another word, the sound of a gunshot rang out from outside. The sharp crack echoed through the saloon, shattering the fragile moment between them. Jesse's head snapped toward the door, his hand instinctively going to his holster, his posture shifting into that familiar, practiced readiness. The patrons in the saloon froze, the noise of the room dying instantly as everyone turned toward the street, unsure of what had just happened. Kate's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. She knew the gunshot wasn't random. It wasn't just a warning, it was a message. Jesse stood up, his eyes still locked on the door. "It's starting, Kate. They won't stop until they have what they want." Kate didn't move. She didn't flinch. She was already halfway to the door, her hand gripping the edge of the bar for support. "Then we'll stop them." The words hung between them for a long moment, the weight of their meaning sinking deep into her bones. The chaos outside was just the beginning. But Kate knew one thing now. She wasn't running. Not anymore. And Jesse Calloway, for all his warnings and his past, was right about one thing. This town was about to change. And she would be the one to make sure it didn't change into something worse. The sudden crack of gunfire shattered the steady hum of the painted rose, the sharp report reverberating off the wooden walls and sending a shiver down Kate's spine. Her heart skipped a beat, then pounded harder in her chest. The sound was followed by the frantic scramble of patrons diving under tables, ducking behind chairs, and scrambling for cover as chaos erupted inside the saloon. Kate's first instinct was to move toward the bar and grab the gun hidden beneath it. But the scream of splintering glass drew her attention to the window. She saw the unmistakable silhouette of men outside, rifles raised, their figures outlined against the hazy sky, moving closer through the dust. Horace Wheeler's thugs. They were coming for her place. Kate's breath caught in her throat. The Painted Rose had always been a safe haven for the lost and the broken, but tonight it felt like a target, a place that everyone wanted to control, and she wasn't going to let it happen without a fight. Before she could move, Jesse's voice cut through the madness, sharp and calm. "Get down, Kate." He was already moving, his hand on his revolver, his eyes locked on the door. He didn't hesitate for a moment. Kate's pulse raced as she watched him, the storm of gunfire ringing in her ears. For a split second, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The flash of rifles, the sound of boots hitting the floor, the shouts of frightened patrons. But Jesse was a man who had seen this before, but he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "Stay low and get to the back," he ordered, his voice firm, almost too calm for the situation. Kate opened her mouth to protest, to tell him she wasn't about to cower in the back like some helpless bystander. But the words caught in her throat as another round of bullets tore through the window, sending glass shards scattering across the floor. A hot, unfamiliar fear gripped her chest, and for the first time, she hesitated. Jesse's gaze never wavered. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with surprising force, guiding her toward the back of the saloon. "Now," he growled, his voice low and filled with urgency. Reluctantly, she followed him, her mind racing as she moved, her feet light against the floor. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, her eyes locking onto the chaos unfolding outside. The thugs were closing in. Another round of gunfire rang out, ricocheting off the walls and thudding into the far corner of the saloon. The window shattered, sending the sound of broken glass through the air. The Painted Rose was no longer a place of refuge. It was a battlefield. Jesse didn't stop moving, pulling Kate into the shadows of the back hallway. The sounds of the fight outside were muffled, but she could still feel the vibrations through the floorboards beneath her feet. She wanted to fight, wanted to take a stand, but she knew Jesse had the experience. He was the one who could do this, and for now, she had to trust him. A few minutes passed like hours, the tension building, thick and suffocating. Kate's breath was shallow, her mind running through every possible outcome. What would happen when Jesse went out there? What was his plan? She could hear the faint sounds of movement outside, but nothing that suggested a retreat. Jesse was still out there, still holding his ground. The door creaked open, and Kate's heart stopped. She didn't know if it was him or if the chaos had found its way inside, but her body tensed as she stood in the shadows, watching the door. Jesse appeared in the doorway, his face hard, his revolver in hand. His eyes swept over the saloon, looking for any sign of danger, but there was nothing but silence. He stepped outside, his breath caught in her throat as she watched through the crack in the door. The confrontation was swift. The thugs were still trying to regroup, but Jesse moved with the kind of precision Kate had only ever seen in men who had been in too many fights to count. His movements were fluid, there was no hesitation. His first shot rang out, dropping one of Wheeler's men in the dirt. Another followed quickly, a well-placed shot that sent another thug stumbling back, his rifle falling from his hands. Kate's pulse raced as she watched him, each movement calculated and deadly. He didn't kill them, but it was clear that he wasn't out there to make friends. He was sending a message, one that would be remembered. The gunfire stopped almost as quickly as it had started, the men who remained clutching their wounds or running for cover. Jesse stood there, his gun still drawn, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The moments stretched, and for a second, Kate wondered if the world would ever return to normal. But Jesse didn't flinch. He was a man who had seen too much to be rattled by chaos, too focused on his mission to let the violence shake him. He holstered his gun, his back straight, his expression still unreadable as he turned and walked back inside. Kate's breath rushed out in a sharp exhale as the door slammed shut behind him. Her hands were shaking, her chest tight with the remnants of fear and adrenaline. She hadn't realized just how much she had been holding back until it was over. Jesse walked toward her, his eyes meeting hers as he passed. For the first time since he entered, there was a flicker of something in his gaze, something that wasn't all business. But it was fleeting, and in the wake of the gunfight, it quickly disappeared. He stopped in front of her, his expression hard again. "That's what happens when you get in the way, Kate," he said, his voice low, but there was something in his eyes that softened just a fraction. "You're in this now. There's no turning back." Kate swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't just standing by, she wasn't just watching anymore. She was in this fight, whether she was ready for it or not. "Then I'm not backing down," she said, her voice steady, the fire in her chest rekindling. Jessie met her gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. But in that silence there was understanding, that there was no going back. She was drawn into his world, whether she liked it or not, and for better or worse, they were now in this fight together. The flickering oil lamp cast long shadows across Kate's office, the room still and heavy with the weight of the day's events. The saloon outside hummed with life, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses muffled by the thick wooden walls. But inside her office, everything was too quiet, too still. Kate sat at her desk, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the letter from the sheriff. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, and cruel, each letter pressing deep into the paper, like Coldwell's words were trying to carve themselves into her soul. "The law has eyes on you. Betrayal comes at a price." Her stomach tightened as the words settled in. The sheriff was tightening his grip, and she could feel the noose around her neck, growing tighter with every passing day. She wasn't just a target because of Jessie. Coldwell had set his sights on her, on everything she had fought for, the saloon, her independence, and now it felt like he was after something much bigger, something tied to her father's past. Kate set the letter down slowly, as if its weight might crush her if she moved too quickly. The bitter taste of betrayal lingered in the air, and she clenched her fists in frustration. The sheriff's message wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. A warning she wasn't sure how to face. Her gaze flicked toward the door, half expecting someone to burst through with more bad news. But it was quiet, too quiet. With a shaky breath, Kate stood and walked to her quarters, the weight of the letter still pressing on her chest. She hadn't wanted to be alone tonight, but there was nowhere else to go. Her thoughts were tangled with too many questions, each one digging deeper than the last. She couldn't outrun them anymore. Once inside her room, she closed the door behind her and moved toward the small desk in the corner. She lifted the family locket from where it had been resting in the drawer, feeling the cool metal against her fingertips. She hadn't looked at it in days, not since she'd first opened it and seen the photograph of the man who could have been her father. Kate sat down on the edge of her bed, the weight of the locket in her palm heavy with meaning. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the photograph inside. The man's face, worn and faded with age, looked back at her, his eyes intense, his jaw set in a way that reminded her of someone she knew far better than she cared to admit. Jessie. The resemblance was unmistakable. It hit her like a bolt of lightning. She had thought it before, but now, in the quiet of her room, it was undeniable. Jesse Calloway, the outlaw, the man who had walked into her life and turned it upside down, looked like the man in the photograph, like her father. Kate's pulse quickened, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred deep within her chest. Could it be possible? Had Jesse known? Had he been searching for something all along? Something tied to her family, to her father? Her hand trembled as she closed the locket, a sudden thought striking her like a punch to the gut. What if Jesse had known more about her father's disappearance than he had led on? What if he had been using her saloon as a means to an end? Her mind raced as she set the locket aside and turned her attention back to the desk. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones, the way everything was starting to connect in ways that made her stomach churn. She needed answers. Kate's eyes caught something tucked behind the locket's compartment, a small envelope, yellowed with age. She reached for it, her heart pounding as she tore it open, the paper fragile between her fingers. Inside was a letter, written in the same scrawled handwriting as the note from her father that had been left with the locket. Her breath caught as she read the words, her heart sinking deeper with each line. "My dearest daughter." If you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. I have made enemies, men who seek to control more than they are due. There is a fortune hidden away, but it is not just wealth, it is power. Power that will give those who possess it control over Silver Creek. I fear the man who will seek to claim it. He is already watching, and I know he is near. Beware the one who smiles while stabbing you in the back. They are closer than you think. Take care of what is yours. I leave you with this warning and with my hope that you never have to face the monster that comes for it. Kate's breath came in shallow gasps as she read the final words over again. A fortune, power, control. The pieces were falling into place, but with each revelation, the weight of the situation grew heavier. The sheriff wasn't just after her saloon, he was after her father's hidden fortune, and Jesse had been searching for it all along. He had known. The betrayal stung like a brand, burning deep into her chest. She had trusted him, had let him in, and now she realized he'd been using her all along, just like Coldwell and Wheeler. The anger surged up in her, quick and fierce, but it was tempered by a gnawing sense of betrayal. She wasn't just an innocent bystander in this game. She was a pawn. Kate stood up, pacing the room, her mind in turmoil. She had trusted Jesse, had let him into her world, and now she saw the truth. But there was no turning back, not now. She couldn't let them win, not the sheriff, not Wheeler, not anyone who thought they could control her life. The pieces were falling into place, and the world was starting to make sense in the most painful way possible. Jesse had been chasing something, and Kate had been foolish enough to think that his reasons were anything but selfish. She had been a means to an end. But now she had to decide what to do with the truth. The question of whether to confront Jesse hung in the air like a loaded gun. Could she trust him again? Could she afford to? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was. Kate wasn't going to let anyone control her, no matter who they were or what they wanted. With a fierce resolve settling in her chest, Kate wiped away the last of the doubt and turned toward the door. She would fight this battle on her own terms, and if Jesse was in the way, then so be it. She wasn't the helpless woman she had been when she first met him. She would protect her family's legacy. She would protect the Painted Rose, and she would make sure that, this time, betrayal didn't win. The air inside the Painted Rose felt thick with tension, like a storm was rolling in. The laughter and chatter from the patrons outside were distant now, drowned by the frantic rhythm of Kate's heart. She moved through the saloon with a purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a fear she wasn't ready to face. She found him sitting alone in the corner, as she knew he would be, always the quiet one, always brooding. Jesse Calloway, the man who had walked into her life with a promise of something different, something dangerous, something she'd foolishly let in. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she stopped in front of him, her eyes narrowing as she stared down at him, fury and hurt making her chest tight. "You knew about my father, didn't you?" Her voice trembled, but there was more than just anger in it. There was pain. Pain she hadn't been prepared to feel. "You knew all along." Jesse didn't move, didn't say anything. His eyes were trained on the table as though the words he didn't want to say could be avoided by staring at the wood grain. But Kate wasn't about to let him off so easily. "I asked you, Jesse," she said, her voice rising. "You told me you weren't here for the treasure, but you lied. All this time, you've been searching for it, my father's treasure." For a long, heavy moment, Jesse said nothing. His jaw tightened, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of his glass, but his eyes remained cold, distant. Kate could feel the space between them grow wider with every passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, almost reluctant. "You're right." The words felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "I've been searching for your father's fortune. That's why I came here. That's why I've been watching you." Kate felt like she had been punched in the gut. The breath left her lungs, leaving only the sharp sting of betrayal in its wake. She didn't know whether to scream or collapse. She had trusted him, had let him into her life, into her world, and now she saw the truth. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking, the hurt undeniable. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jesse's gaze shifted, and for the briefest moment, Kate saw something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, maybe even regret, but it was gone too quickly for her to hold on to. I didn't want to drag you into it, Kate. I didn't want you to be a part of this. He paused, running a hand through his hair, his tone shifting into something colder, more determined. But this treasure, it's the only thing that'll keep you safe. It's the only thing that'll get you out from under the sheriff's thumb. I didn't want you to get hurt. Her chest tightened at his words, but the anger surged again, hotter this time. So what, you were using me, watching me, using my family's past to get what you wanted? Jess's eyes hardened, but there was something in his gaze, something softer, less certain, that made her hesitate. I didn't expect things to go this way, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I didn't expect to care. Care? Kate's laugh was bitter, cutting through the air between them. You're telling me you've been lying to me, using me all along, and now you want to act like you've got some kind of feelings? Jesse stood up, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as though he was battling the urge to walk away. His voice was tight with frustration. I didn't want to hurt you, Kate, but I couldn't walk away from this, from your father's legacy, from what's at stake. And I sure as hell didn't want to drag you into this mess, but I couldn't stay away from you either. Kate's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to believe him. Part of her wanted to throw herself into his arms, to forgive him. But the part of her that had fought for everything, her saloon, her independence, her dignity, would never let her go down that road again. Not like this. Not after everything that had happened. You need to leave, Jesse, she said, her voice firm, her hands shaking with the effort it took to hold herself together. I don't know who you are anymore, and I sure as hell can't trust you. Not now. Not after everything. The words felt like knives, each one a deep cut that left her raw. But they were the only ones she could speak, the only truth she could hold on to. Jesse's face tightened, and for a moment he seemed like he might argue, might try to change her mind, but instead he just nodded. The look in his eyes, torn, regretful, but also resolute, made her stomach churn. He was the one who had betrayed her, but it was she who had to stand strong. I'll go, he said, his voice low and rough, but I'll come back when the time is right, when you need me, Kate, whether you like it or not. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. I don't need you, Jesse. I never did. His gaze softened, his eyes lingering on her one last time before he turned toward the door. The weight of the moment hung between them like a shadow, and for a moment, Kate thought she might reach out to stop him, to beg him to stay. But she didn't. She couldn't. Jesse stepped out into the night without another word. The door swung shut behind him with a hollow thud, and Kate stood there, her chest tight, her mind racing with everything she didn't want to face. He was gone. But part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And whether she liked it or not, part of her knew that the danger, the mess they were both tangled in, wasn't finished. It had only just begun. The night air was cool against Kate's skin as she stood in the doorway, watching Jesse disappear into the dark streets of Silver Creek. Her heart thudded in her chest, every beat a reminder of the choices she had made, the lines she had drawn in the sand. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she could trust anyone anymore, not even him. Jesse had promised to come back, but she wasn't sure if that promise meant anything. As his silhouette faded into the shadows, Kate felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Regret, anger, longing, all twisted together. The door closed softly behind her, and the saloon felt quieter than it had ever been before. And for the first time in a long while, Kate didn't know what to do next. The days after Jesse's departure blurred together. The saloon, once filled with the noise of laughter and clinking glasses, now felt like an empty shell. Kate spent most of her time alone, the heavy silence pressing down on her as she tried to make sense of everything. Her father's legacy, the treasure, Jesse. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to fit together just enough to make the picture clearer, but it also made her question everything she thought she knew about the world around her. Kate sat behind the bar, the familiar weight of the family locket resting in her palm. She hadn't looked at it much in the past few days, not since she discovered the photograph inside. But now, it seemed more important than ever. The locket had always been a relic of her past, a reminder of the mother she'd lost, the father she'd never known. But now, it felt like something more. A map. A key to the secrets that had been buried in Silver Creek for far too long. The weight of those secrets pressed down on her. But it wasn't fear that stirred in her chest. It was resolve. She wasn't going to let the sheriff or Wheeler or anyone else pull her strings. She had too much at stake now, too much to fight for. Kate stood up, her fingers still wrapped around the locket. The room around her felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the knowledge that everything she had built could be taken away by men who saw only their own gain. But not if she had anything to say about it. Her gaze swept across the saloon, the familiar sights suddenly feeling foreign. The tables, the worn wood of the bar, it was all part of a larger story, a story that didn't just belong to her. It belonged to her father, to her mother, to the land around Silver Creek. She wasn't about to stand idly by and watch that story be rewritten by corrupt men. With a deep breath, Kate dropped the locket back into her pocket, her mind made up. The town had been taken over piece by piece, but she wasn't going to let them have the Painted Rose. She would fight back. Not just for herself, but for the truth. For the legacy of the father she never knew. The truth about Silver Creek, her father's treasure, and the power that had been hidden from the world. She would uncover it all. Kate wasn't a passive player anymore. She was ready to fight, to stand her ground and to find the answers that had eluded her for so long. No more running, no more hiding, the sheriff's threats, Wheeler's games. None of it would stop her now. She had a purpose, and nothing would stand in her way. The next few days were a blur of searching, questioning, and piecing together the fragments of information that had been buried for years. Kate moved through Silver Creek like a ghost, watching, listening, always searching for the next clue that would unlock the mystery of her father's past. The more she dug, the more she realized that the treasure her father had hidden wasn't just money or jewels. It was tied to the very land around Silver Creek. And it wasn't just about wealth. It was about power, the kind of power that men like Coldwell and Wheeler were willing to kill for. She had always known there was something off about the way Coldwell ran things. He was too smooth, too polished for a man who called himself a lawman. But now she understood. The sheriff wasn't just a man of the law. He was a man of control, of manipulation, willing to do whatever it took to own Silver Creek. Kate sat in her office, the land map spread out before her, her fingers tracing the lines of the land her father had once owned. She had the pieces now, the scattered details from Mrs. McKinley, Sam, and the other townsfolk who had seen too much and said too little. And as she stared at the maps, a truth began to form in her mind. Coldwell hadn't just been after her saloon. He was after the land surrounding it, the very heart of Silver Creek. Her father's fortune wasn't just a chest of gold. It was tied to the land. Hidden somewhere within those rolling hills, those flat plains, was something that would make anyone with enough power want it. Kate stood up, her pulse quickening as she pieced it all together. The sheriff and Wheeler had been making deals for years, and now Kate understood what they were really after. The land. The control over Silver Creek. Her father's hidden treasure wasn't just about wealth. It was about the future of the town itself. And Kate, in all her years of fighting to keep the Painted Rose standing, had become part of that fight. Her thoughts turned to Jesse. Had he known? Had he been working with Coldwell all along, using her to get closer to the treasure? The bitterness still lingered, but now it was tempered with a sense of understanding. Jesse hadn't been just a man chasing after riches. He had been chasing something bigger, something that could change everything. But that didn't excuse the lies, the secrets, the betrayal. Kate felt a surge of anger mixed with resolve. She wasn't just fighting for the saloon anymore. She was fighting for the future of Silver Creek, for her father's legacy, and if it meant going up against the sheriff, Wheeler, and the rest of the town's corrupt power brokers, then that was what she'd do. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, but Kate had no intention of backing down. She had a plan now, a way forward. She'd use every scrap of knowledge, every ally she had, to uncover the secrets of the land and the fortune hidden within it. Silver Creek had been in the grip of men who thought they could control everything, but Kate wasn't about to let them have it all, not without a fight. With a firm breath, Kate rolled up the maps, tucking them away in her desk. She had work to do, and there was no turning back now. The Painted Rose was quiet now, quieter than it had been in days. The saloon's walls, old and weathered by time, seemed to sigh under the weight of secrets they had borne for years. Kate moved through the space with purpose, her steps deliberate, the worn wood creaking beneath her boots. She had spent too many nights staring at maps and old papers, piecing together the puzzle of her father's past. The clues had led her here, to the back of the saloon, to a place no one had dared enter in decades, a place that held the answers she needed. The floor beneath her feet was solid, but there was a faint echo of hollow space beneath it. Kate knelt by the corner of the bar, her fingers tracing the edge of the floorboard, searching for the hidden mechanism her father's letter had alluded to. The tension in her chest tightened as she pushed against the wood, hearing a faint click as a hidden latch released. Slowly, carefully, the floorboard lifted, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Kate hesitated. Her heart raced in her chest, a mix of dread and anticipation building inside her. She had been expecting this, but now that the moment was here, she wasn't sure what she would find. The hidden passage beneath the Painted Rose had always been a story whispered in the corners of town, a tale of treasure and danger. No one had ever dared venture down, not for years. But Kate wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid of the dark, and she wasn't about to back down from the truth. With a deep breath, she descended into the passage, the faint scent of earth and old wood surrounding her as she made her way down the stairs. The air was thick with the weight of forgotten years, the kind of silence that only old places could hold. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, cramped room. The air was stale, but there was a sense of history here, something important. Kate's eyes swept over the space, her gaze falling on the table in the center of the room. Maps, old documents, and a pile of worn papers were scattered across it. She moved closer, her fingers trembling as she sifted through them. Each map, each piece of paper, told a story she hadn't known she was part of. And then, at the very bottom of the pile, she found it. A letter, yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places but still legible. Kate's breath caught as she unfolded it, her hands shaking as she read the words her father had left behind. To my dearest daughter, if you are reading this, know that I am no longer able to protect you. The men who would take everything from you have already started their work. Caldwell is not just a lawman. He's a man of ambition, willing to do whatever it takes to control this town. He has been after the treasure for years, and now he will stop at nothing to claim it for himself. The maps you will find here are the key to finding what he seeks. The treasure is not just gold or silver. It is the power to control Silver Creek. He will kill for it, protect it with your life. I am sorry, my dear, but I do not know how long this will last. If you ever find this letter, know that you are stronger than I ever was. The fate of this town rests with you now. Kate's heart pounded in her chest as she finished reading. The truth was clearer now than ever before. Sheriff Caldwell wasn't just after her father's legacy, he was after control. The treasure her father had hidden wasn't about wealth, it was about power, the kind of power that could change everything in Silver Creek. The sound of boots on the stairs interrupted her thoughts, and Kate's pulse quickened. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She could feel the presence before he even spoke. Found what you're looking for? Jesse's voice was rough, but there was an edge to it now, something different from the last time they had spoken. He stepped into the dim light of the room, his eyes scanning the documents scattered across the table. Kate stood slowly, her mind still reeling from the letter in her hands. Jesse, she said quietly, the words laced with both suspicion and relief. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to fight him or pull him close. You knew, didn't you? You knew all along about my father's treasure, about Caldwell's plan. Jesse didn't flinch. His gaze met hers, unwavering. I did. I've been looking for it for years. I didn't want to drag you into this, Kate, but this... He gestured to the letter in her hand. "This is bigger than both of us." Kate's chest tightened as she held his gaze, the betrayal still lingering, but also a strange pull she couldn't ignore. "And what about you, Jesse? What's your part in all this? Were you just using me to get to the treasure?" He stepped closer, his expression softening just a fraction, but there was still that guarded look in his eyes. "I never meant to hurt you, Kate. I didn't expect to get involved like this. But I've seen too much, and I know too much now to just walk away." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I came back for you, for this." Kate's mind raced, her emotions a whirlwind. She wanted to be angry, to tell him to leave, but the truth, the undeniable truth, was that she needed him. Together, they were the only ones who could stop Caldwell and Wheeler. Together, they could expose the sheriff's corruption and take back the town that had been stolen from her. "I won't let them win, Jesse," she said, her voice steady now, her resolve stronger than ever. "We'll bring justice to Silver Creek." Jesse's eyes softened, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them like a promise. "We will. But we have to be smart about this. Caldwell's not going down easy. Neither is Wheeler." Kate nodded, determination burning in her chest. "Then we'll take them down together." As Jessie stepped closer, she didn't flinch. There was no time for hesitation now. The past had brought them here, but it was the future they were fighting for, and whatever came next, Kate knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would face whatever came their way. Together, they would fight for Silver Creek. Part 3. Kate stepped into the Painted Rose with a weight on her shoulders, the familiar scent of whiskey and tobacco now thick with something else, a sense of purpose. The saloon had never felt this heavy, this full of secrets. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to reverberate with the past, with the things her father had left behind. The dust in the air felt like 1,000 unspoken truths hanging low and thick between her and the future she was beginning to The back room was darker than usual, the light from the gas lamps too weak to fight the shadows that clung to the corners. She moved without hesitation, her boots steady on the floor, her heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the place where everything would change. She had spent the entire night in the quiet of her office, surrounded by old papers, her father's maps, and the letter that had set her on this path. The weight of the discovery had been heavy on her chest, and now she was standing at the threshold of everything she had been searching for. The back room smelled of wood, stale air, and something ancient. The floorboards were old, worn from years of heavy footsteps, but there was a slight hollow sound in one corner that pulled her attention. Her pulse quickened. This was where it all began, where the passage had been hidden, where the treasure waited. Kate knelt, her hands tracing the edges of the floorboards, feeling the rough texture of the wood. She could feel the weight of the beams above her, the secret that had been buried beneath them, waiting for someone with enough will to uncover it. Her fingers found the edges of the boards, and with a grunt of effort, she began prying them loose, her muscles straining under the weight of what she was about to uncover. The floor creaked in protest, but Kate wasn't deterred. She pulled with everything she had, the boards groaning and splintering until, with a final satisfying crack, she cleared enough space to see the dark, narrow staircase that led downward. Her breath caught in her throat. There it was, just as her father's letter had described. A passage hidden under the very heart of the Painted Rose. Kate swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she took a step forward. She could feel the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her, and yet there was something strangely comforting about it. This was hers. The past, the treasure, the fight. It was all in her hands now. She descended the staircase, her boots echoing softly in the narrow space, each step taking her deeper into the unknown. The air was cool and musty, thick with the scent of earth and time forgotten. It was as if the underground room had been sealed off for years, untouched by the world above. As Kate reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The air was cooler here, the silence heavier. There, in the corner of the room, partially buried beneath cobwebs and years of dust, sat a trunk. It was an old wooden chest, bound in iron, a relic of a past that had been locked away for far too long. Kate's pulse quickened as she crossed the room, her fingers tracing the rough edges of the trunk. The lock was rusted, but her father's handwriting, the very thing that had brought her here, ran through her mind like a thread she couldn't escape. She knelt beside the trunk, her hands trembling as she worked the lock free, the metallic groan of it breaking the stillness around her. With a final tug, the chest opened. Kate's breath caught as she peered inside. Stacks of old maps, contracts, and documents spilled from the trunk, yellowed with age but still legible. Her heart raced as her fingers slid over the brittle pages. This was it. This was what she had been searching for. Her father had left behind more than just a fortune. He had left a map to the very heart of Silver Creek's darkest secrets. Her hand trembled as she picked up a leather-bound journal. The weight of it felt strangely familiar, as if she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. She opened the cover, her eyes scanning the first few pages. There, in her father's familiar, hurried scrawl, was the truth. The treasure wasn't just gold, it was knowledge. Her father had known the sheriff was corrupt long before he disappeared. The journal detailed everything. The deals Caldwell had made with Wheeler, the land grabs, the manipulation of the town's resources. The fortune wasn't just buried in the earth, it was buried in the town itself. The power to control Silver Creek had been hidden beneath layers of deceit, waiting to be uncovered. Kate's breath was shallow as she flipped through the pages, each one revealing more about the man who had been her father. He hadn't just left her a legacy of wealth, he had left her the tools to fight back. The treasure, the maps, the knowledge, it was all here. And now, it was hers to use. Her eyes darted over the last page of the journal, her fingers trembling as she read. The sheriff seeks to claim the land, but he will not succeed. Not if you are brave enough to stop him. The weight of those words hit Kate like a punch to the gut. Her father had known what was coming. He had known that Silver Creek would be torn apart by greed. He had known she would be the one to stand against it. And now, Kate had everything she needed to fight back. Her father's secret wasn't just a treasure, it was a weapon, and Kate wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. She closed the journal slowly, her mind racing with plans, with the realization that the game was about to change. The sheriff and Wheeler thought they had everything under control. They were wrong. The real power was in Kate's hands now. Kate ascended the stairs to her office with a steady grip on the leather-bound journal, her fingers white-knuckled against the worn cover. The weight of the secrets it contained felt too much to bear, yet too important to ignore. Every step she took was a step deeper into a world she had barely begun to understand, the sounds of the saloon fading as she moved farther from the chaos below. When the door clicked shut behind her, the world outside seemed to still, and Kate leaned against it for a moment, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The journal, now resting against her chest, felt almost sacred, as if it carried more than just words. It held the key to her future. She needed to know what it said, needed to understand her father's final wishes. With a heavy heart, she moved to her desk, locking the door behind her. No interruptions. Not now. The journal's pages felt rough under her fingers, the ink still sharp against the yellowing paper, but it was the letter she sought. She could feel it. Her father's last words, the final message he'd left for her. Her hands shook as she unfolded the letter, a steady pulse of anxiety drumming in her chest. Her breath caught as she read, "My dearest daughter, by now you've no doubt learned that things are far darker than they appear. The sheriff, Caldwell, and that rat Wheeler have been conspiring to take everything from this town. They don't care about right or wrong, they care about power. They've been orchestrating land deals, driving people into submission through fear, bribery, and manipulation. They want Silver Creek's land for themselves, and they will stop at nothing to take it. I've hidden the deeds to the land you and I fought for under the floorboards of the Painted Rose. They are yours now, to protect, to keep them from the men who would ruin this town for their gain. I only wish I had more time to explain everything to you, but I trust you can see the truth. Stay strong. The power to save this town and its people lies within your hands." Kate's breath faltered as she reread the letter. the words burning into her mind. Caldwell had been playing a game all along, a game she hadn't even known she was part of. The treasure her father had left behind wasn't just wealth. It was a map to save Silver Creek. The deeds, the land titles, hidden right under her feet, were the key to taking back control from men like Caldwell and Wheeler. Her father hadn't just left her something to be claimed. He'd left her the power to fight. She leaned back in her chair, the letter trembling in her grasp. Everything fell into place with a clarity that was both terrifying and freeing. The Painted Rose wasn't just a saloon. It was the heart of the town's future, the place where everything could be decided. And her father's legacy was far more than just a piece of land or treasure. It was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that the town's soul had always been worth fighting for. Kate closed the letter, her mind racing with plans and questions. She understood now that she wasn't just fighting to keep her business alive. She was fighting to take Silver Creek back. And the battle wasn't going to be won with whiskey and cards. It was going to be won with land, power, and the strength to stand against the men who had tried to tear everything apart. The realization hit her like a storm. She was no longer just a saloon owner. She was a key player in the fight for justice in Silver Creek. This wasn't just about survival. It was about righting the wrongs that had been done to the people she had come to care for. Her resolve solidified, the anger that had simmered in her chest now turning into something sharper, something with a purpose. The sheriff had underestimated her. Wheeler had thought her weak. But Kate Mercer wasn't about to sit back and watch her town fall apart. Her father's plans were clear now, and it was up to her to make sure they didn't die with him. She stood from the desk, her heart pounding, the letter still in her hand. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be without sacrifice. But it was a road Kate was ready to walk. She wasn't just going to survive anymore. She was going to fight, and with the hidden deeds in her possession, she would see this fight through to the end. The power to take back Silver Creek had always been hers, and now Kate Mercer was ready to take it. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over Silver Creek as the town held its breath. It was the kind of quiet that always preceded trouble. Kate stepped out of the Painted Rose, the cool air mixing with the distant murmur of the street. The saloon had always been the pulse of the town, but today, it felt like the heartbeat of something larger, something that could change everything. Her boots hit the dirt street, the familiar sound of spurs jingling as she made her way outside. But today, the town wasn't its usual self. The faces she passed were more cautious, eyes darting over their shoulders as if someone was always watching. And they were. Sheriff Caldwell's men had been patrolling the streets more than usual, keeping a close eye on every movement, every whisper. They weren't just trying to control her anymore. They were trying to control everyone. Kate felt it too, that tightening sense of being boxed in, her every move under scrutiny. The sheriff and Wheeler knew something was coming, and they weren't going to let her and anyone else who might stand with her take control without a fight. She turned a corner, and there they were. A small group of townsfolk gathered by the side of the saloon, their heads huddled together in quiet conversation. Kate recognized them. Men and women she had seen at the bar. Farmers, ranchers, workers who had been getting by day in and day out under the thumb of the sheriff and his cronies. They all seemed to be talking in hushed tones, their faces drawn tight with worry. Kate walked toward them, her presence cutting through the unease like a knife. As she approached, the whispers stopped, all eyes turning toward her. She could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else, a flicker of hope. The kind of hope that only came when a change was in the air, when a person like her might have the power to tip the scales. Mrs. McKinley, the school teacher, was the first to step forward. Her face was pale, but her back was straight, and there was strength in the way she held herself, despite the tremor in her voice. "Kate," she said, her voice low but strong, "the people in this town, they're ready for change. We're tired of living under their boo heel." Kate felt something in her chest tighten. The woman was right. The town had been held hostage by men like Caldwell and Wheeler for too long. But the people here, they were more than that. More than cattle to be herded. Kate's saloon wasn't just a business. It was the last bastion of freedom in Silver Creek. And it was about to become something much bigger, The quiet moments stretched, the weight of Mrs. McKinley's words settling between them. Kate could see the faces of the others. There were ranchers, farmers, workers, each of them holding their breath, waiting for her to speak. Kate lifted her chin, her eyes hardening with resolve. "It's not just about the painted rose anymore," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a thunderclap. "It's about this town, the people here who've had their backs broken by men who think they can own everything. But they're wrong. This land is ours, and we're going to take it back." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of doubt, but of agreement. They had seen the power in her eyes, felt the heat of her words. Kate knew it wasn't going to be easy. She wasn't naive. But she also knew the people in this town, real, hardworking people, had finally reached the point where they were ready to fight. "I'm organizing a meeting," Kate continued, her voice steady now, the weight of her decision pressing down on her but not breaking her. "I'll bring together the farmers, the ranchers, the saloon owners, everyone who's had enough. We'll stand together and we'll confront Coldwell and Wheeler. It's time to take a stand." Mrs. McKinley stepped forward, her hands shaking but her voice resolute. "We're with you, Kate. We're ready to fight. We've got nothing left to lose." The fire in Kate's chest flared, and she could feel it in the eyes of everyone around her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't about her father's legacy or her saloon. It was about something bigger, about the future of Silver Creek, about the land and the people who had been pushed aside for too long. Kate met the eyes of the people gathered before her, one by one. Each of them carried a spark, something ready to burn, and she felt the pull of that fire in her own bones. "We take back Silver Creek," Kate said, her voice low but firm. "We fight for it, together." And with that, the first step was taken. The meeting would be called, the lines would be drawn, and the battle for Silver Creek had only just begun. Silver Creek was slowly turning into a powder keg, and Sheriff Coldwell was the spark waiting to set it off. His presence in town had grown more noticeable, more frequent. Each visit to the Painted Rose felt like an inspection, his eyes cold and calculating, scanning every inch of the saloon as if trying to measure just how far he could push Kate before she cracked. It was the same pattern every time. He'd walk in like he owned the place, his boots clicking sharply against the wooden floor, the faint scent of tobacco and leather trailing in his wake. The other patrons would quiet, eyes darting nervously, but Kate held her ground. She'd seen enough of his kind to know intimidation when she saw it. Coldwell wasn't just playing the lawman. He was playing a game of control, and he was getting more aggressive by the day. This evening was no different. The saloon was busy, the usual mix of dust-covered cowhands, weary travelers, and local farmers filling the air with a hum of conversation. Kate stood behind the bar, a glass of whiskey in her hand, when the door swung open with a sharp jingle. "Coldwell." His eyes swept the room before landing on her, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He didn't approach immediately, but she could feel the weight of his gaze bearing down on her. Finally, he made his way toward the bar, the soft jingle of his spurs the only sound in the otherwise hushed saloon. "You keep it running well, Miss Mercer," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness as he leaned casually against the bar. "But you know, things could run a whole lot smoother if you'd just get with the program." Kate's grip tightened on the glass, but her voice remained calm, steady. "I'm not interested in playing your game, Coldwell." His smile widened, though there was no warmth in it. "You sure about that? Because you're running out of time. The longer you drag your heels, the harder it's going to get for you. This town's mine, and you're either going to fall in line or find yourself out in the cold." Kate didn't flinch. She had faced worse than him before, men with more power and less nerve. "I've got more fight in me than you think, Sheriff. And I'm not the one who should be worried." Coldwell's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest of moments, she saw a flash of something behind his otherwise controlled facade. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not by someone who refused to bend. "You'll learn soon enough," he muttered, his voice low, dangerous, as his hand brushed just a little too close to her shoulder. The gesture wasn't accidental, but Kate didn't recoil. She was done with being intimidated. "Not by you, Sheriff," she said firmly, her eyes locking with his. "You've already made a mistake thinking I'd bow down." He didn't reply immediately, the tension hanging thick between them like a drawn bowstring. His jaw tightened, but all he did was turn on his heel and walk away, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. He knew. She was no longer just a nuisance, she was a threat. And it was that realization that made his presence linger long after he had left. That night, the local inn was filled with the kind of quiet that made even the dust seem heavy. The flicker of lanterns cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Kate stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the gathered crowd, each face familiar yet distant. These were the people she had been serving drinks to, nodding to in passing. But tonight they weren't just patrons. Tonight they were something else. As she spoke, her voice was steady, but beneath the calm exterior, her heart was hammering. This wasn't just about her father's treasure anymore. This was about the future of Silver Creek, the future of every man and woman in this room. "My father left us more than just a saloon," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Fate left us a fight. The sheriff and Wheeler think they can control this town. They've been trying to take what's ours for years. But we're not going to let them anymore. Not while we still have the power to stand together." The crowd was silent at first, the weight of her words sinking in slowly. Kate could feel the eyes on her eyes that had once looked away, that had once been too afraid to act. But tonight there was a shift. A few murmurs began to rise, quiet at first, then louder as others joined in. "We've been living under their booth heel long enough," Mrs. McKinley said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "It's time to stand up. We have the strength, Kate. We can take back what's ours." The tension in the room shifted, and Kate could see it in their eyes. The farmers and ranchers, the people who had worked the land, who had been beaten down by corruption and greed, they were ready. They were hungry for change. Kate's words had ignited something in them, a spark that had been waiting for a match. "This isn't just about land," Kate continued, her voice steady, gaining momentum. "This is about us, about the future we want for our families, for our children. If we don't fight now, we'll lose everything, and I won't let that happen." A quiet murmur of agreement spread through the room. Farmers clenched their fists, ranchers shifted in their seats, their backs straighter. Kate's gaze swept the room, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. These were the people who would stand with her. These were the people who would help her take Silver Creek back. As the meeting came to a close, Kate found herself surrounded by the very people she'd once thought of as strangers. Their faces were no longer just familiar. They were allies, and they were ready to fight. "Thank you, Kate," one of the ranchers said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've given us a reason to hope again." Kate nodded, her chest tight with something deeper than just gratitude. The weight of what they were about to do was massive, but so was the fire in her heart. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but Kate had never been more certain of her purpose. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for them, for the people of Silver Creek, and she wasn't going to stop until they had reclaimed what was rightfully theirs. The morning sun beat down hard on Silver Creek, the oppressive heat pressing into the streets, making the air shimmer like an open flame. Kate stood by the window of the Painted Rose, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass as she stared out, lost in thought. The weight of the town's expectations pressed down on her like a heavy load, suffocating her with its urgency. She had spoken to the farmers, the ranchers, and the other saloon owners. They were all waiting on her now, looking to her for direction, for a plan to confront the sheriff and Wheeler. But with every passing day, the task seemed bigger, more impossible. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of spurs jingling, the door to the saloon swinging open with a sharp jingle. The room went quiet, every head turning toward the doorway. There, standing in the frame of the door like a shadow from her past, was Jesse Calloway. Kate's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight of him. He was no longer the man who had walked out of her life. He was harder now, his face more weathered, his eyes colder. The familiar weight of both relief and tension settled in her chest. He was here, but he was also a reminder of everything she'd tried to forget. Jesse's gaze swept over the room before locking on hers, his eyes dark and unreadable. His jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood there, framed by the light spilling in from outside, the air around him thick with unspoken words. Finally, his voice broke through the silence, low and firm. "I'm here to finish this." Kate's heart raced, the sound of it pounding in her ears. He was here to finish it. Finish what? Everything she had started? The mess they had found themselves in? She wasn't sure if his return was a relief or a curse, but one thing was certain. Her world had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. She fought to keep her emotions in check, but it was hard. Too many feelings churned inside her. Anger, confusion, relief, desire. She hated that he still had this effect on her, that she couldn't just shut the door on him and walk away. But she had learned the hard way that the world didn't work that simply. And now, there was too much at stake, too many lives on the line. "Why now?" Kate asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She crossed her arms over her chest, trying to block out the pull she still felt toward him. "You leave when I need you the most, and now you waltz back in like it's nothing?" Jesse's eyes softened, but just for a moment. His hand rested on the doorframe, his posture weary but resolute. "I didn't want to leave, but I had to. There was work to be done. I've learned more about Coldwell's operation. I've pieced it together." His voice was low, but there was a conviction in it that set Kate on edge. "I've got allies in the U.S. Marshal's office. We're ready to move in. We've got a plan. We can take him down, Kate, but we've got to do it now, or it'll be too late." Kate's mind raced as she processed his words. The U.S. Marshals. They were ready to act. She wasn't sure what to feel. He had been gone, and now he was back with a plan. But the question lingered, why had he really returned? Her eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into her voice. "And why should I trust you now, after everything?" Jesse stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as though every movement was calculated. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes not leaving hers. There was a rawness in his gaze, something she hadn't seen before. A man who had seen too much and been too long in the dirt, but still held on to something worth fighting for. "Because I'm not the same man who left Kate," he said, his voice rough but earnest. "And you're not the same woman. You've been fighting this fight without me, but now I'm here to help. We've got a chance, but it's slipping away fast." Kate's breath hitched as she looked at him, the tension between them thickening. She could feel the weight of his words sinking in, the gravity of the moment settling on her shoulders. She had been standing alone for so long, carrying the weight of the town's future on her back, but with Jesse's return, everything had changed. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them. About the fight that needed to be fought and the people who were depending on her. She swallowed hard, trying to push away the mix of feelings swirling inside her. "What's the plan?" Jesse's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while there was a flicker of something like relief in his eyes. "We move fast. We expose Coldwell's ties to Wheeler and his land grabs. The marshal's office will have enough to make arrests, but we need to show the people that they're not powerless anymore. We take away his control, and we show them that Silver Creek belongs to the people, not the corrupt few." Kate nodded, her resolve hardening. She had no more time to waste. No more time to question Jesse, to doubt him. He was here, and whether she liked it or not, they were in this together. "Then let's do it," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the haze of doubt. "We take him down. For Silver Creek." Jesse gave a small approving nod, and the air between them shifted. The tension that had been thick with distrust started to settle into something else. A sense of purpose, something they both needed, and something they hadn't shared in a long time. Kate felt the weight of the moment. The undeniable chemistry still smoldering between them, but there was no room for distraction now. There was a town to save. "Right," Jesse said, his voice now low with determination. "Now, let's get to work." Silver Creek had never felt heavier. The days leading up to the final confrontation were filled with restless energy that seemed to hum through the streets, echoing off the saloon's worn walls and curling into the corners of every building. The town was a powder keg, and Kate could feel the weight of it on her chest. Everyone knew what was coming. Coldwell and Wheeler had held the town in their grip for far too long, and now it was time to fight back. Kate stood by the window of the painted rose, her hand resting on the edge of the worn wooden frame. The light outside was fading, the sky a bruised purple as the evening settled over the land. Her fingers drummed against the sill, a nervous habit she couldn't shake. It wasn't fear that plagued her. It was the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The plan was set. She had the deeds to her father's land, the leverage they needed to finally tear Caldwell's empire down. Jesse had rallied the lawmen, the U.S. Marshals were on their way, and soon it would all come to a head. She felt the eyes of the town on her as she made her way toward the sheriff's office. The streets were quiet now, too quiet, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Kate's steps were steady, though her heart was pounding, each beat a reminder of the stakes. She was no longer just a saloon owner. She was the town's last hope, and she would either sink or swim with the choices she made in the coming hours. Inside the sheriff's office, Coldwell was seated behind his desk, his back to the door. He didn't know it yet, but he was already cornered. The man who had thought he could control everything in Silver Creek was about to lose it all. Kate could feel the power in her hands, the weight of the deeds as she placed them firmly on the desk before him. The quiet crack of the paper against the wood felt like the sound of chains breaking. Caldwell turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on her. The suspicion in his gaze was immediate, but he didn't move. Not yet. "You're getting bold, Ms. Mercer," Caldwell said, his voice low, threatening. "You think these will save you?" Kate's lips curled into a cold smile. She wasn't here for niceties. "No, Sheriff. I'm here to end it." His brow furrowed as he stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. The tension in the room thickened, his body language radiating danger. "You don't know what you're up against," he spat. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "You've lost, Coldwell," Kate interrupted, her voice steady and clear, a sharp contrast to the anger in his. The words hung in the air like a promise, and her gaze locked with his. "Your game is up." The sheriff's face darkened with fury. He reached for his gun, the movement quick but measured, the unmistakable sound of leather pulling against metal filling the space. Kate's breath hitched for a moment, but she didn't flinch. Before Coldwell could make his move, the door to the sheriff's office crashed open with a deafening bang. The sound of boots on the floor, fast and heavy, signaled the arrival of the U.S. Marshals. They flooded the room in a single fluid motion, their guns drawn, their faces grim with determination. Coldwell froze. His hand still hovered over his gun, but his eyes widened in disbelief as the lawmen closed in on him. "Sheriff Coldwell," one of the marshals barked, his voice sharp. "You're under arrest for land theft, bribery, and corruption. You have the right to remain silent." Kate stood in silence, her heart racing, but her face betraying no emotion as Coldwell was quickly subdued. The realization of his downfall was slow to settle in, his movements jerky and desperate as they handcuffed him, stripping him of the power he had abused for so long. The marshal's hands were firm on Coldwell's shoulders, guiding him out of the office. But Kate didn't look away. She watched, feeling the heat of the moment burn through her chest. The people of Silver Creek had finally seen the sheriff for what he was. A liar, a thief, a man who had betrayed them all. Outside, the cheers erupted like a sudden storm, the roar of the townspeople lifting the weight that had settled in the air for so long. The sound was deafening, the townsfolk rushing into the streets, clapping each other on the back, shouting in jubilation. The fear that had once held them all captive had been broken. The chains had been undone, and for the first time, Silver Creek felt free. But Kate didn't join in the celebration. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the sight of Coldwell being led away. Her father's legacy, the deeds, the land. It was all more than just a victory for her. It was a victory for the whole town, for everyone who had suffered under the sheriff's iron fist. And as the noise of the crowd swelled around her, Kate felt a strange peace settle in her chest. For once, Silver Creek was theirs again, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the future was hers to shape. The battle had been hard fought, but it was over now. Coldwell was gone. And as the town celebrated, Kate allowed herself a quiet moment to reflect. They had won, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Yet, for the first time in years, Kate Mercer felt like she might finally have a chance to breathe. The sun rose over Silver Creek with a promise. The kind of promise that only a town reborn could carry. Coldwell was behind bars, and the iron grip he'd held on the town was slipping away, one breath at a time. The air was different now, lighter, more open, as though the weight of years of corruption and fear had finally lifted, if only just. Kate stood in the center of the town, the morning light cutting through the dust as she shook hands with one of the farmers, his calloused hand warm against hers. Jesse stood beside her, his eyes scanning the crowd, taking it all in. They were a team now, partners in more than just business. The town was counting on them to make things right, to keep the wheels of this fragile new peace turning. Kate felt the hum of excitement in the air, the eager energy of people who had been waiting for this moment their whole lives. Farmers, ranchers, business owners, all of them lined up, ready to take back what had been stolen from them. She had walked this road before with nothing but her own resolve. Now there was something different, a sense of unity, a shared purpose, and Jesse beside her, steadier than he had ever been before. They walked from one conversation to the next, shaking hands and signing papers. The deal was simple enough. Fair prices for the land, security from future exploitation, and a guarantee that no one would be forced to bend to the will of men like Coldwell or Wheeler ever again. The townspeople had been held hostage for so long they were hungry for something better. As the day wore on, the Painted Rose began to take shape, not just as a saloon, but as a symbol. People from all walks of life came in and out of the building, bringing food, tools, supplies, and ideas. The saloon had always been the heart of the town, but now it was more than that. It was a place where people could gather, where they could share their stories, plan their future, and know they were no longer fighting alone. Kate stood at the bar that evening, looking over the room with a sense of quiet pride. It was just a saloon, but it had become the center of something much larger. She glanced over at Jesse, who was wiping down the counter, his sleeves rolled up, his focus on the work. He had become a part of the town in a way that she hadn't expected. Once an outlaw, now the man who helped her build something that would outlast them both. "You did good today," Kate said, her voice quiet but sincere. Jesse glanced up, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "I didn't do it alone." His voice was low, almost reflective, as though he had thought about this before. "No, you didn't," Kate agreed, her eyes locking with his. "But you were the one who came back. That counts for more than you think." The air between them was thick with unspoken things. Their history, the journey they'd shared, the tension that had always been there but had been reshaped by the work they'd done together. There was no more distance between them, no more questions about trust. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They were partners in this life, and whatever came next, they would face it together. As the days passed, their bond deepened. They spent long hours working side by side, sorting through the town's legal matters and meeting with people who had suffered for too long. Kate's confidence grew as the people began to trust her more. They had seen her stand strong against Coldwell, seen her fight for their rights, and now they knew that with her at the helm, Silver Creek would thrive. Jesse, once a man on the run, now found solace in this new life. The tension he carried, always watching his back, always alone, had started to ease. There was something about this town, something about Kate, that made him want to stay. He had walked away from it all once, but now, he realized, he didn't want to. The Painted Rose wasn't just a saloon, it was a home. A new beginning for both of them. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden hue over Silver Creek. The evening air was warm, but not uncomfortable, and the horizon burned with shades of orange and pink. The street was quieter now, the hustle of the day dying down, and the town seemed to exhale in the fading light. Kate and Jesse stood side by side on the porch of the Painted Rose, their eyes fixed on the view before them. The sounds of the town, the creak of a wagon wheel, the chatter of the last few stragglers on their way home seemed to blend into the background. There was peace here, the kind of peace that didn't come easy but was earned with every step, every sacrifice. And now, after everything, Kate could breathe. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her past ease. The orphaned girl, the saloon owner, the woman who had been left behind by the world, she was no longer alone in the fight. The future stretched out before her, wide and open, a road she would walk with Jesse at her side. "I don't think we could have done it without each other," Kate said quietly, her voice holding a hint of something deeper, something unspoken between them. Jesse's gaze lingered on her, his expression softer than usual, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Guess you're right," he said, his voice rough with something Kate couldn't quite place. Their eyes met, the unspoken understanding passing between them. They had rebuilt not just Silver Creek but themselves. The pieces of their lives that had once felt broken, lost, or beyond repair had come together, and in each other they had found something worth holding on to. As the sun finally sank below the horizon, Kate leaned her shoulder against the wooden post of the porch, her breath steady, her heart calm. They had won. The town was theirs again. And for the first time in her life, Kate felt like she had everything she needed. Together, they had built something that would last, something worth fighting for. And for the first time, Kate wasn't just looking at the town, she was looking at her future. And Jesse, whether by fate or choice, was standing right beside her, ready to walk it with her. The wind carried the scent of the land, fresh and free. And for the first time in years, the horizon looked endless. The road ahead was theirs. Silver Creek had grown in ways no one could have predicted. The once dusty town had transformed into something alive, breathing with the energy of a community reborn. The creaky old buildings had been replaced with sturdier ones, paint fresh on the boards, the streets lined with thriving businesses. People walked with their heads higher, their steps more certain, and the air was lighter. The weight of fear had lifted, and the promise of a better life had settled in. Kat Mercer stood at the edge of the town, her eyes scanning the horizon. Silver Creek had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to what could happen when a town came together and stood its ground. With Jesse by her side, she had built something lasting, a place where justice, fairness, and freedom weren't just words, but lived truths. It was a legacy that neither of them could have imagined all those years ago when they first met, but now it was theirs. As she stood there, her thoughts turned to the people who had helped make this possible, those who had fought beside her, stood up against corruption, and had trusted her when she had nothing to give but hope. The farmers, the ranchers, the workers, they were all part of this, part of a future that they had taken into their own hands. And Kate, standing here now, could finally see the town as something more than just a place. It was a community, and it was theirs. The sound of boots on the street interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Jesse approaching. He walked with a calm, measured pace, the familiar jingle of his spurs adding to the soft symphony of the day. His face was the same as it had been when he returned to Silver Creek, rough around the edges, but now there was something else in his eyes. Peace, maybe, or contentment. It was a look that had taken time to come by, but now it felt permanent. He stopped beside her, standing silently for a moment, both of them gazing out at the town they had rebuilt. "It's a good sight, ain't it?" he said, his voice rough but warm. Kate nodded, her lips curving into a smile. "Better than I ever imagined," she replied. Jesse let out a slow breath, his eyes still fixed on the town. "We did all right," he said, more to himself than to her, but Kate heard it, and a warmth spread in her chest. "Not just us," she said, glancing at him. "It's the town, Jesse. We can't take all the credit." His lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile touching his face. "No, I reckon not. But we did build something. Together." She could feel the sincerity in his words, and for a moment everything else fell away. The noise of the past, the struggle, the betrayals. What was left was just them, standing together, knowing that they had changed the course of this town's future. Kate's gaze drifted toward the distant hill, the land stretching out before them. She could feel the weight of her father's legacy in that land, strong and steady, just like the man who had left it to her. He had never been able to protect it, but Kate had. She had fought for it, not just for herself, but for the people who depended on her. "You ever think about him?" Jesse's voice cut through the stillness, the question gentle but knowing. Kate glanced up at him, and for a moment she hesitated. It was a question she'd asked herself many times since her father's death, since she had uncovered his legacy. He had been a man of contradictions. He had left her a treasure, yes, but more than that, he had left her the strength to face whatever came next, to fight when no one else would. "I think about him every day," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But I've made peace with it. I've made peace with who he was and what he wanted for me." Jesse nodded, as though he understood more than she could say. He turned his gaze back to the town. "You've done him proud, Kate. You've done more than most folks could ever dream." She felt a flush of warmth at his words, and for a moment she wished she could say more, that she could put all the gratitude and unspoken emotions into words. But there was no need. Jesse had always understood her in a way no one else did. The sound of the wind picked up, the trees rustling in the distance, and the soft glow of the setting sun painted the town in hues of orange and pink. It was peaceful now. The town was no longer under the shadow of fear, and neither was Kate. "I'm heading to the grave," she said suddenly, her voice soft but firm. "I want to take a moment with him and thank him for everything." Jesse's expression softened, and without a word he fell in step beside her. Neither of them spoke as they walked, the weight of their past and their shared journey settling between them. When they reached the hill where her father was buried, Kate stood in front of the marker, her eyes tracing the engraved name. The past had been painful, and so much had been left unspoken, but it was in moments like this that Kate found clarity. Her father had left her a legacy, not of gold or riches, but of strength. And it was that strength, that courage, that had seen her through. She placed a hand on the gravestone, her fingers lightly brushing the cold stone. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Jesse stood beside her, his presence steady, grounding her in the quiet moment. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was enough. They stood there for a long while, the sun setting behind them, the town that they had rebuilt stretching out below. When Kate finally turned away, Jesse was there. His gaze met hers, and without a word they walked back down the hill, side by side. There was a quiet peace in the air now, the promise of a future that was theirs to shape. The town was free, and Kate Mercer, once an orphan and an outsider, had found a place where she truly belonged. The horizon stretched wide before them, and the road ahead was clearer than it had ever been. Together, they were ready for whatever came next.